Chapter 338. Ever since she became pregnant, Mo Jingshan had changed from teasing her physically to teasing her verbally. Jin Wan was already used to it. Mo Jingshan could only lie on the bed, and she would glare at him even if he moved his arm. Now that he could finally walk and hold her, the man's arms around her waist gradually tightened, as though he was going to imprison her in his arms and never let her go. Both of them were wearing hospital gowns. Because Jin Wan was too thin, her clothes appeared particularly loose. The man only gently tugged at them, and the 2 buttons on her chest were directly undone. Being held in the man's arms like this couldn't be more convenient. Jin Wan tilted her head. "I'm less than 2 months pregnant," he replied vaguely, "and I know. A few days ago, when I went for a checkup, the doctor said that it was too early to see clearly. I'll go for a checkup when I have time in the next few days." I didn't know that a prenatal checkup would be so troublesome. The man's kiss spread to her collarbone and then moved back to her neck and finally fell on her lips. He pressed her against the wall by the window. Although he held her tightly, he avoided her stomach and pried open her lips and teeth to invade. They kissed for a long time. Jin Wan didn't struggle. Anyway, Mo Jingshan knew better than her. Sure enough, as they kissed, they forgot about each other. When they were ready, the man pressed against her, and the 2 of them stood against the wall. He leaned against her neck, panting, and his husky voice was almost against her ear. "There's still 1.5 months to go. It's uncomfortable." Jin Wan wanted to laugh. She held it in for a long time and finally laughed. She raised her hand to hug the man who seemed to be acting coquettishly. Anyway, she defined Mo Jingshan's words of uncomfortable as acting coquettishly. She smiled and held his neck. "Grandpa, didn't you want us to have a football team? You have to bear with it sooner or later. After you give birth to one, who knows when you'll have to give birth to a second one. You'll get used to it." The man suddenly pinched her chin and kissed her again. Then he kissed her cheek and moved to her ear to coax her. "One is enough. Do you think I don't know that you go back to your ward every morning to secretly vomit behind my back? Just one is already so difficult to endure. How can I bear to let you suffer this kind of suffering again?" Jin Wan found that Mo Jingshan's appearance really gave people the impression that he was a man of few desires. However, when she really got to know him better, she realized that this man always had the ability to make people drown in his kisses. If she wasn't pregnant now, when he could finally move, he would probably kiss her and throw her onto the bed at any time. When she went for another prenatal checkup, the results this time were not very different from the previous one. It still looked good, but compared with ordinary pregnant women, the fetus was not very stable. This had something to do with Jin Wan's cold womb and her experience in the past 20 days and her poor sleep every day. She slept well in Mo Jingshan's ward, but every day she was always worried about his wound, and she was always in a bad mood. Occasionally, she would have nightmares in which Dolly pointed a gun at her. Due to all these factors, the little thing in her stomach was not very stable. It was slightly smaller than normal. The doctor reminded Jin Wan to eat more, get more nutrition, rest more, and stay calm. She did not need to worry too much. So in the last few days of Mo Jingshan's stay in the hospital, Jin Wan didn't sleep in his ward under the doctor's advice but obediently recuperated in her own ward. This time, Mo Jingshan could walk around at will, but she could only lie in bed and watch this man's ambiguous expression when he came to visit him from time to time. It was really, the tables had turned. There were so many Chinese in Los Angeles that the Spring Festival in China could be felt in the major shopping malls and streets here. On the day before New Year's Eve, Mo Jingshan could finally be discharged from the hospital. When he walked out of the hospital, Shine Group's car was already waiting outside. In other words, Mo Xiaozi didn't intend to give them any room to choose. Since they had returned to Los Angeles, they naturally had to listen to his arrangements. A middle-aged driver came out of the car and nodded respectfully to Mo Jingshan. CEO Mo, long time no see. Are you feeling better? Chairman Mo asked us to pick you up. The driver was a Chinese man in his 40s named George. He had been a butler and driver for the Mo family in Los Angeles for many years and was very familiar with Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan glanced at him indifferently. Did I say I would go back today? George paused and explained, but tomorrow is the Spring Festival in China. Chairman Mo learned that you were discharged today, so he specially sent us to pick you up and Nanheng was not here today. Feng Ling, Kay, and the others were going to send them to Mo Jingshan's residence in Los Angeles, but now the Mo family came to pick them up. They didn't say anything and were about to move Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan's things to the car. Mo Jingshan said, "Put them down." Feng Ling and Kay paused, took down the luggage that was about to be put in the car, and turned to look at Mo Jingshan, waiting for his instructions. "Put them in our car." Mo Jingshan was expressionless and took a look at George. "If there's time, I'll go back tomorrow." "You can go." George had been in the Mo family for many years and certainly knew the relationship between Mo Jingshan and the Mo family. He didn't say anything, nodded, and returned to the car. After waiting for a moment, seeing that Mo Jingshan really didn't want to get in the car, he had to drive back to Shine Group. There were 2 cars parked in front of the hospital. The black Bentley appeared on the busy street of Los Angeles at about 4:00 in the afternoon, followed by a car belonging to Feng Ling and the others. It wasn't until 6:00 that they arrived at 11 Base. The winter day was too short and the sky was already dark. Jin Wan didn't expect that she could visit the base as soon as she was discharged from the hospital. When Mo Jingshan arrived, Nanheng was talking with someone inside. When he came out, he didn't look as casual as usual. He took a solemn look at Jin Wan and Feng Ling and then went in with Mo Jingshan to have a private chat. This was a very private place in 11 Base. Jin Wan didn't go in but let Feng Ling and Kay take her to other places. After visiting the shooting range and some close combat training areas, Jin Wan looked at the few young men who were still training in such cold weather and turned to look at Feng Ling, who was always dressed in black. "Did you used to be like this every day?" Chapter 339. Mrs. Mo, don't be fooled by Feng Ling's thin body. Every time we train, she is better than us, and when we fight, she is always the first one. In terms of close combat, 80% of the people in our base can't beat her, and the remaining 20% can only beat her if they have a chance. She is very fierce. Kay said as he put his hand on Feng Ling's shoulder boldly as if he were getting along with a brother. Feng Ling didn't avoid him but said coldly, "I refuse to be flattered." Kay smiled. "What's wrong? Are you afraid that Mrs. Mo will raise your salary when she finds out your status in our base?" "Alas, it's not that Mrs. Mo can't afford it. Get lost." Feng Ling raised her hand and slapped him away. "I'll walk here with her for a while." "Why are you always following her? I don't think you can have a private conversation with Mrs. Mo. Last time, you were so embarrassed that you almost smashed my cell phone." Before Kay finished speaking, before Feng Ling raised her foot to kick him, he nimbly dodged and ran away. Jin Wan stood on the side of the training ground with a smile, glanced at Kay's back as he ran away, and then turned to look at the people who were training inside. She touched the metal railing next to her with both hands, and the cold touch made her feel that everything was real. Just like in Cambodia, in such a heavy training base, it seemed that everyone had a gun on their waist, and from time to time, she could hear the rhythmic sound of gunfire coming from the shooting range. "You can't enter this kind of place easily, can you?" Jin Wan asked. Feng Ling stood next to her, looking in the same direction as her, and answered lightly, "N." Jean Wan turned to look at her. Then how did you get in? I happened to save a person from their base and was introduced by him, but I was too small when I was a teenager. I was a woman, but I had to pretend to be a man, so I looked even thinner and smaller in a group of newcomers. At that time, Nanheng was very averse to me and didn't think highly of me. He tried many ways to force me to leave, forcing me to undergo the most intense training and tests. It almost cost me half my life, but I still refused to leave. Maybe I do have talent and explosive power in this aspect. I'm small, but I'm strong, and I can bear hardships. Later, I changed from the little thing he didn't think highly of to the person he occasionally had to get up in the middle of the night to train with me. Jean Wan leaned against the metal railing and looked at her. Nanheng's nature should be very cold and difficult to get along with. It's hard for him to change his opinion of someone he doesn't think highly of. Just like before, I felt that he didn't like me. If it weren't for Mo Jingshan, he might not even have bothered to say a few words to me. It's really not easy for you to change his opinion of such a stubborn man. He's that kind of person. He's ruthless, but you have to be more ruthless than him. Feng Ling raised her chin and pointed to several people who were training in close combat. When I was 17, my body was basically developed. At that time, the clothes I wore were especially loose. When I was training with them, I was afraid that they would find out my true gender, so there was a period of time when I didn't dare to move. Nanheng fought with me several times and found that I had strangely become timid, so he directly beat me to the ground. At that time, the weather was especially cold. He told me to lie here for an hour and not to get up. If I dared to get up, he would kick me once. So ruthless. I didn't get up at that time. I lay there for the whole night, thinking of all kinds of ways to hide my chest and figure, and in the end, I fainted from the cold. And then? There was no then. When I woke up, Kay and the others sent me to the infirmary. I woke up quickly and opened my eyes as soon as I reached the infirmary. Afraid that they would find out that my body was different, I pushed them away and ran back to my room alone. I took a hot shower, but I still caught a cold. I had a high fever for 2 days and slept alone for 2 days. Then I recovered. Maybe it's because I'm young that I don't care how my body is tortured. From her words, it was clear that she meant that Nanheng did not come to visit her at all. She said it so lightly, but a young girl in her teens already had such a strong endurance. Even now, when she mentioned these things, she did not seem to feel any pain or grievance. Hearing this, Jean Wan felt an inexplicable surge of emotions surging in her heart. Feng Ling, can you teach me how to shoot? Why do you suddenly want to learn how to shoot? Last time in Cambodia, I fired that shot. If you hadn't come in time, I probably would have shot myself again. Who knows what will happen in the future? Anyway, I could train here now. Can you teach me? Who said that only men had a hero complex? Women also had it. No one wanted to be the one who held others back when they were in danger. It was always good to have a skill. Feng Ling wanted to say that it was better to teach her some simple self-defense skills than to shoot, but when she was about to speak, she remembered that Jean Wan was pregnant and couldn't learn these things that required extreme movements for the time being. Then teach me, but I feel that even if you learn it, you won't be able to use it in the future. Let's talk about whether I can use it or not. The main thing is that you are too handsome. I want to be as handsome as you. In the evening, the training time on the shooting range had just ended, and then there was a gunshot. When an important guest in the base's conference room heard the gunshot, he calmly commented, "This sounds like a newcomer." Nanheng glanced at the time and then exchanged a look with Mo Jingshan, who was sitting on the other side. He then stood up and looked at the situation on the shooting range through the base's surveillance cameras. He saw that Feng Ling and Jean Wan were each holding a gun. Feng Ling taught Jean Wan how to hold a gun, and Jin Wan imitated her. Feng Ling fired a shot and hit the bullseye. Jin Wan also fired a shot. Fortunately, the bullet didn't fly out, but it only hit the third ring. Seeing the accuracy of this woman's shooting, Nanhing recalled the shot that Jin Wan had fired in the nick of time in Cambodia. He narrowed his eyes and sneered, turning to say, "Your woman is learning how to shoot from Feng Ling. It seems that the promise you made to Elder Mo to not stain your hands with blood will be taken over by your wife. Is it because she was stimulated last time and wants to learn some skills so that she can fight with us in the future?" Chapter 340. Nanhing raised his brows. Not necessarily. A person's potential is limitless. Previously in Cambodia, it was enough to prove that sometimes, the most unexpected people can become the key to victory. Furthermore, no matter how good Jin Wan's marksmanship was, she clearly wanted to protect her man's heart. Mo Jingshan, who had mostly recovered, revealed a hint of a smile on his lips. Between the two of them, one was here, and the other was slowly learning how to shoot at the shooting range. Even from such a distance, she could still forcefully feed him a mouthful of dog food. Nanhang's lips twitched. He moved away from the monitor screen to allow Mo Jingshan to continue admiring his wife's back view. The sky gradually darkened. The base was surrounded by bright lights, especially the shooting range. The lights here seemed to be brighter than the other training grounds. Even though the wind was bone-chilling, Jin Wan was still in the mood to play. She fired at a target 50 meters away. Reality proved that she really could not hit a target more than 100 meters away. However, within 50 meters, she could basically hit a 5-ring target. Initially, Feng Ling stood by her side to teach her all the movements. Now, it was Jin Wan who stood by her side to train her aim. Feng Ling would occasionally speak up to guide her on which positions were not standard. Just like that, she trained for more than half an hour. In the cold wind, Jin Wan was covered in sweat. She moved to the side over 10 steps, planning to challenge the target 100 meters away again. Pang! It tilted again. Jin Wan pursed her lips. As she loaded the gun, she said, "Feng Ling, your marksmanship is so good. How many years did you practice? Do you need to practice for this 100 meters for a long time? I feel like the wind speed will also affect the direction of the shot." No one behind her answered her. Jin Wan raised the gun and continued to aim at the target 100 meters away, planning to shoot again. All of a sudden, she felt a warmth on the back of her hand. Just as she was about to shoot, she paused. Without turning back, she knew it was Mo Jingshan. The man's clean and refreshing scent surrounded her. He didn't say anything and only stood behind her, holding her waist and straightening her posture. He held her fingers with his other hand and said in a low and hoarse voice by her ear, "Try it now." Jin Wan felt that her hand did not seem to be much different from before. However, it seemed like a certain angle that she had not been able to control had been corrected. She calmly aimed at the target 100 meters away and forcefully hooked her fingers. Bang! Bullseye. Looking at the bullseye that was shot through, Jin Wan, back then, in Cambodia, she had repeatedly feared that something would happen to Mo Jingshan. In the end, it turned out that he had never intended to shoot. She was about to ask him what he was doing, but because of his gaze, she subconsciously turned her head to look inside. Mo Jingshan looked ahead, coldly watching Su Jilan, who had just walked out of the door of the villa, and the man's aura instantly reached a new height. A few days ago, Mo Jingshan was sickly, pale, and weak, but now he was as cold and grim, exuding a silent and chilling aura of alienation. Jin Wan had thought of countless possibilities. She had thought that the person she would meet here was in Shuyan. After all, Mo Xiaozi intended to play matchmaker with his most capable secretary, but she never expected that it would be Su Jilan. Since Su Jilan was here, Jin Wan glanced at the villa. Then the Su family should be here too. No wonder there were so many cars in the parking lot. She turned to see a gray-haired old man through the window of the villa. In the Mo family, except for grandfather Mo, there was no other old man of this age, so she guessed that this should be the legendary elder Su. Did he hear that they would come back for the reunion dinner after failing to enter the hospital to see Mo Jingshan, so he came to the Mo family to wait. Jin Wan's good mood suddenly exploded. Chapter 341. Mo Jingshan's expression was cold and handsome. He held Jin Wan's hand and turned to leave, not intending to stay a moment longer. Jin Wan had just been pulled a few steps when Mo Xiaozi's cold voice rang. "You just came back and you're leaving." Mo Xiaozi didn't expect that Mo Jingshan would pull Jin Wan away without any reaction. Jin Wan paused because of Mo Xiaozi's voice. After all, as a daughter-in-law, it was not good for her to be too arrogant. Mo Jingshan didn't let go of her hand. He brought her to his side, put his palm on her back, and forcibly led her out of the Mo family's simple black European-style door. He said calmly and coldly, "Ignore them. Let's go." With that, he strode out with Jin Wan. At this time, Elder Su heard the noise and had already come out. He looked at the door. Although he was old, his eyes were bright and full of spirit. The reason she came here today was indeed because of Mo Jingshan. Before coming here, he had doubted whether Mo Jingshan would come back, but today was the Spring Festival in China, and he was in Los Angeles. He couldn't just pass by his house 3 times without entering, so he came here to take a gamble. But Mo Jingshan's attitude said it all. At this moment, Su Jilan stood there, watching the two of them who were almost far away. She might have thought it was not difficult at first, but after facing the ruthless and unconquerable Mo Jingshan in the hospital, and seeing the two of them who didn't even look back, she suddenly felt that everything was too unreal. Jin Wan was wearing a white cashmere coat, which made a couple with Mo Jingshan's black coat. From their backs, the man was tall and straight, and the woman's slender figure was perfect. Standing together, they were indeed a perfect match. Jin Wan's long, curly, fluffy hair fell from her shoulders and scattered on her back. The ends of her hair were covered by the man's palm when he pressed against her back. They stood so intimately and dazzlingly. Su Jilan hid the reluctance and depression in her eyes. She looked up and saw that Jin Wan seemed to be thinking about something and hesitated, but the man firmly pulled her away. "Jingshan," Mo Xiaozi said angrily to their backs. "Are you going to make us feel upset during the Spring Festival? Why are you leaving now that you're back? Come here right now." Mo Xiaozi had just finished speaking when a female voice rang out. "Jingshan is back. Where is it? Did he bring my daughter-in-law over?" Hearing this voice, Mo Jingshan's footsteps slowed slightly. Jin Wan subconsciously turned her eyes to see a well-maintained middle-aged woman looking out the door eagerly. Jin Wan had some impression of her because when she and Mo Jingshan got married, Mo Xiaozi didn't attend at all, but Mo Jingshan's mother took the time to fly all the way back to High City from the United States to attend their wedding. Although they had only met once, Jin Wan recognized that this was Mo Jingshan's mother, Ms. Wanzhu. Wanzhu saw them at a glance, and when her eyes met Jin Wan's, she smiled kindly and waved at Jin Wan. "Daughter-in-law, why are you leaving? Come back. We've made a lot of good food just waiting for you." On the day of their wedding, Ms. Wanzhu took Jin Wan's hand and called her daughter-in-law several times. At that time, Jin Wan was very resistant and pulled her hand out. Regardless of whether she was being polite or not, she turned to the backstage of the bride's makeup shop. At the thought of this, she felt a pang of guilt in her heart. She immediately turned around decisively, took Mo Jingshan's arm hard, and led him back. After returning to the yard of the manor, Jin Wan said with a smile, "Just now, Jingshan said he came back in a hurry and didn't buy any gifts for the spring festival. He was going to take me to buy gifts with him. We didn't say we were leaving." Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows and glanced sideways at the little woman who actually spoke up for him. Hearing this, Wan Zhu came out with a smile and took Jin Wan's hand. "Oh, your hand is so cold. We're going back to our own home, not to a guest. Why did you buy gifts? Besides, Jingshan, if you want to buy something, go by yourself. It's so cold. Let Jin Wan go home to warm up." With that, she took Jin Wan inside. The difference in attitude between the mother-in-law and the father-in-law was really too big. Mo Shaozi still stood in front of the door with a dark expression. When Mo Jingshan saw that Jin Wan had been obediently dragged into the door, he nodded indifferently to Elder Su who was standing in front of the door. Elder Su smiled lightly. "It seems that Jingshan doesn't welcome us." Mo Jingshan's cold and clear eyes swept over Elder Su. He said indifferently, "Elder Su, you worry too much. After all, you're a guest. How can I not welcome you?" At this time, Su Jilan stared at Mo Jingshan's face and smiled at him. "Jingshan, I grew up with my grandfather. There are too few people in the Su family, and this year's New Year is particularly lonely, so I came here to spend the Spring Festival with Uncle Mo and Auntie Zhu. I didn't expect you would really come back." Mo Jingshan nodded indifferently. "Okay, then please have a seat." With that, without saying anything more, he picked up the electronic car key, locked the car on the parking lot, and walked in. At this time, Jin Wan had been pulled into the living room by Mo Jingshan's mother. The decoration style of the Mo family in the United States was different from that of the Mo family in High City. In High City, the decoration style was simple and spacious, with green mountains and clear waters suitable for health, while the Mo family's decoration style was quite exquisite. It was obvious that Mo Jingshan's mother was in charge of everything in the family. Mo Shaozi, a middle-aged man suffering from male chauvinism, might not even touch a vase in the family. "I heard that you were all in the hospital a few days ago. Are you all right? Is Jingshan better?" Wan Zhu asked the servants to bring fruit and tea while looking at Jin Wan with a smile, as if she were looking at her own daughter-in-law. Having been treated coldly by Mo Shaozi for a long time, Jin Wan was not used to the enthusiasm of Mo Jingshan's mother. She was pulled to sit on the sofa and didn't take off her coat, so she hurriedly nodded. "It's all right. Dad went to the hospital to visit him a few days ago. He was resting at that time, so he didn't see him, but Jingshan has always been in good health." Chapter 342. Jin Wan sat here, exchanging pleasantries with Mo Jingshan's mother. When Mo Jingshan entered the door, he saw Jin Wan's spoiled expression. The living room was very hot. Not far away, there was a common Western fireplace on the wall, facing her. The little woman seemed to have forgotten to take off her coat. At this moment, not knowing whether it was because of embarrassment or the heat, her face was faintly red. Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows slightly and his eyes revealed a slight smile. "If you don't take off your coat, I'll roast you for New Year's Eve dinner." Wan Zhu came to herself and looked at Jin Wan with a smile. "Girl, why didn't you take off your coat when you came in? It's 27 degrees in this room. It's so hot. Give me your coat and I'll ask someone to hang it up for you." Jin Wan hurriedly took off her coat, handed it to the servant who came over, and nodded to the servant to thank her. Mrs. Wan Zhu seemed to find that Jin Wan was very different from when she first got married. She smiled. "The last time I saw you was at your wedding with Jingshan. You were actually very shy of strangers at that time, weren't you?" Now it seems that the relationship between you two is getting better and better, and you're no longer so distant to me. I was a little shy that day and wasn't very polite. Please don't mind. Jin-won was a little embarrassed because of this. I don't mind, I don't mind. I don't mind, I don't mind. When I was young and just got married, I was also very disgusted with the relatives of the Mo family. I didn't know any of them, but every one of them had to greet me. I was very annoyed, but I still had to keep smiling. I know this feeling too well. After a while, I'll get used to it. Wonju said as she turned to look at Mo Jingshin. Jingshin, are you really not badly hurt? I heard you were in the hospital for a long time. I'm fine now. Mo Jingshin was gentle to his mother. His tone was gentle, which was completely different from the coldness he showed to Mo Xiaosa. That's good. You haven't been back for a long time. Since you brought Wan back this time, why don't you stay at home for a few days? Anyway, everyone in China is on vacation. If there's nothing urgent, don't rush back. I'll see. It was rare that Mo Jingshin did not directly reject her. At this time, Elder Su and Su Jilan entered the door with Mo Xiaosa. Seeing that Jin-won was chatting with Mo Jingshin's mother, Elder Su said with a smile, the news of Jingshin's marriage is really sudden. I didn't know it at all. I didn't expect that I would be so lucky to meet Mrs. Mo this year. Jin-won heard the voice and turned around. She stood up and politely nodded at Elder Su. Hello. Elder Su nodded at her with a smile. Although he was smiling, his eyes were obviously not smiling. After looking at her for a while, he turned to talk to Mo Xiaosa. Jin-won's eyes met Su Jilan's, but Su Jilan looked away thoughtfully. Jin-won, who was being called daughter-in-law by Mo Jingshin's mother, obviously did not intend to look directly at her. When Jin-won sat down again, Mo Jingshin had put down his coat. He hadn't been back to the company for a while, so there was no need to wear the identity of CEO Mo all the time. He was tall and straight, and the paleness and weakness he had shown in the hospital a few days ago had faded away. At this time, he was only wearing a white sweater, and straight trousers wrapped his slender legs neatly. He was dressed fashionably and stood out in this Western-style villa that did not have much spring festival atmosphere. He sat on the sofa on the same side as Jin-won somewhat lazily. When he heard Wonju asking about Jin-won, he smiled and looked at them silently. Mo Jingshin hadn't been back for many years. Even the servants who had watched him grow up didn't know whether to call him Young Master Mo or CEO Mo like everyone else. An older servant seemed particularly happy to see him back. She came up to him and stuffed a freshly washed red apple into his hand. With one look, he knew that the other party must have watched him grow up. Mo Jingshin did not refuse. He sat there, holding a red apple in his hand. His fingers were long and slender, with distinct joints. Perhaps because he had stayed in the hospital for a long time and had not been exposed to the sun for a long time, his skin was fairer than before. The difference between his fair skin and the red of the apple was obvious. He smiled mildly and casually asked the old helper a few questions. It seemed like only in front of his mother and the Mo family's old helpers would Mo Jingshin put on a different kind of temperament. He was as warm as jade, amiable, and much warmer than his usual attitude toward people. Afterward, Elder Su and the others were invited by Mo Xiaosa to sit opposite them and chat. When they talked about the reason for their marriage, Mo Jingshin's expression was as usual. His gaze swept across their faces one by one. Today is the Chinese New Year. It's a day for family reunions. It doesn't seem like we should talk about my marriage. Su Jilan then said, yes, it's also the first time that Jin-won has come to the Mo family. She should not be very familiar with the inside and outside of the house. Grandpa, if you talk to Uncle Mo like this, she will feel uncomfortable. I'm fine, Jinwan said. After all, this is our home. Why should I feel uncomfortable? The smile on Su Jilan's face disappeared. She paused and then said, That's good. I can see that Auntie Zhu is very warm to you, as if she is afraid that you will not be used to it. I was going to let Auntie Zhu do her work first, and I'll accompany you to walk around the Mo family. With that, Su Jilan chuckled again as if she did not see Ji and Wan's indifferent expression and perfunctory attitude. She said with a smile, the Mo family in the United States should be very different from the Mo family in High City, right? There are several Roman statues collected by Uncle Mo in the 1980s. Every time I see them, I'm amazed. Miss G, would you like to have a look? I'll show you the way. Jin Wan smiled lightly. I don't know much about Roman statues. Since Dad specially collects these, he must be an expert. As a layman, I'd better not make a fool of myself. It'll be embarrassing if I pretend to know something. Miss G, I just see that you don't seem to be used to the atmosphere and environment of the Mo family, so I want to take you out for a walk. Su Jilan smiled and said, It's just a tour. What does it have to do with whether I'm an expert or not? Nuan, if you don't like it, you don't have to go to the back to see those things. Those are the things that Jingshan's father collected more than a decade ago. I usually don't bother to ask people to clean them up. Mrs. Wan Zhu said at this time, Wan will stay here for the next 2 days. You have a lot of time to walk around at home. Now that you've just come back, sit for a while and have a good rest. There's no hurry. Chapter 343. Hearing this, Wan Zhu's expression softened. Without waiting for Jin Wan to speak, she turned to Su Jilan, saying, Wan has been very reserved since she got married. She's so slow to warm up. It's rare for me to see her here. Don't scare my daughter-in-law. What if she doesn't dare to talk to me again? Su Jilan's expression froze slightly, and she smiled apologetically. Auntie Zhu, I was just saying. Mo Jingshan sat on the sofa on the same side as Jin Wan's mother. His eyes were cold, and he smiled without speaking. Jin Wan could see that Mo Jingshan's mother was obviously the same kind of person as grandfather Mo. She would definitely protect her own daughter-in-law. In this way, Mo Xiaozi was really a weirdo in this family, but it was no wonder that Mo Xiaozi, a powerful and cold-tempered man, hadn't been able to kick Jin Wan out of the Mo family. After all, the one who slept with him and his own father were on Jin Wan's side. He couldn't bear to have his wife give him gentle pillow talk every day. As for Su Jilan, she was obviously too confident today. Not to mention which side Mo Jingshan's mother was on, Mo Xiaozi really liked the Yin family, not the Su family that he had cooperated with a few years ago. The engagement between the Su family and the Mo family didn't last long. Jin Wan didn't know what kind of relationship the two families had, but from the way they sat and talked to each other, it was clear that they were mostly polite. At this time, Elder Su said, Jingshan, you can't blame Jilan for being so concerned about your family. After all, your marriage is such a big deal. It doesn't matter if other people don't mind, but how can Jilan not mind? She was once part of your life plan, but now you've excluded her. Miss G is now your wife, so it's not an exaggeration for the Mo family to treat her so passionately. Jilan only said a few words of concern. There's no need to treat her so coldly. I only have one granddaughter, Jilan. After a brief pause, Elder Su said in a meaningful tone, I'm already old, and I don't really understand the emotional issues between young people, so I can't get involved. I only have one granddaughter, Jilan. Her parents were in the capital of a war-torn country when they drove past a bomb-filled road after discussing business. Not even a complete corpse could be found. I personally raised this granddaughter of mine. You can say that I'm biased or spoiling her, but you broke off the engagement just like that and returned to High City to marry another woman. Don't you think you should give the Sue family an explanation for this? The window paper that had not been broken was instantly broken by Elder Sue. Mo Xiaozi frowned deeply, and Wan Zhu, who was sitting by Jin Wan's side, fell silent when Elder Sue mentioned Su Zhilan's parents. Mo Jingshan smiled and looked at Su Zhilan with a faint smile. Miss Sue, do you need me to repeat the reason for the cancellation of the engagement in public? Su Zhilan knew that she was in the wrong when she cooperated with Mo Xiaozi and lied that she had saved him, but now Mo Jingshan had put it on the table. If she didn't stop him at this time, she and her grandfather would be humiliated, and she wouldn't be able to force Jin Wan to leave. I understand the reason. Su Zhilan said with an understanding expression. I can understand why Jingshan left the United States, and I don't want to force him to be too responsible for me. Since he loves someone else and doesn't even mention the engagement, I can only wish Miss Ji and Jingshan a happy marriage. Mo Jingshan didn't hesitate at all. He said flatly and coldly, there was indeed an engagement between Miss Sue and me. As for the so-called love and responsibility you mentioned, it's just a question of the benevolent and the wise. Jin Wan is my wife. She didn't interfere in any of my relationships, so there's no need for anyone to point fingers and talk about our engagement. I don't need to explain the truth in detail. Miss Sue and Elder Sue should understand it. Even if it's for the sake of the past, you shouldn't be so heartless to Zhilan. If it were a few years ago, Elder Sue could still stand up and point at Mo Jingshan's face and scold him as an elder, but now he could only complain with an ugly face. Elder Sue, do you mean that after I get married, I still have to care about my ex and take her feelings as my responsibility? Mo Jingshan's tone was as cold as frost, but the sneer in his eyes was obvious. Jingshan, we're guests at the Mo family today. We're just talking about the past. After all, Zhilan has waited for you for so many years. She spent her best years waiting for you. As her grandfather, it's not too much for me to ask for an explanation for her. Seeing Mo Jingshan's cold attitude, Elder Sue finally expressed his dissatisfaction. Hearing this, Jin Wan suddenly said, Miss Sue, how old are you? 24. The people in the living room suddenly fell completely silent, and almost everyone's eyes fell on her. Jin Wan didn't have any intention of backing down. She even faced everyone's different gazes and looked at Su Zhilan with clear eyes. 24 years old is considered a good time. Isn't the golden age for women between 20 and 35 years old? Almost everyone in their teens has the experience of losing the person they love. If everyone holds the person they loved in their teens accountable like this, then there will be too many people in debt in this world. Elder Sue's eyes darkened. Miss Ji, are you clear about what happened between Jingshan and Zhilan? Back then, Zhilan almost married him. Jin Wan smiled lightly and said unhurriedly, with your experience, Elder Sue, I don't think you need me to explain to you how much this so-called almost is. There's no turning back in life. It's fine that you like to reminisce when you're old, but Miss Sue, you're still young, and you're always clinging to what you didn't get in the past. What's the point of that? Are you going to ask me, your legal wife, to back out of the marriage just because you're not reconciled to the fact that you're a little bit short, and then ask her to make up for it? The air was filled with silence and embarrassment. Of course, it wasn't Jin Wan who was embarrassed. She was clearly saying that Su Zhilan relied on Elder Sue's support and even said that it was natural for her to interfere in someone else's marriage. Elder Sue sat here as if questioning Mo Jingshan with the attitude of a dignified elder. Who did he think he was? There was really no one in this world that Jin Wan didn't dare to offend. If others were polite to her, she would naturally be polite, but this boss Sue brought Su Jilan to her door during the new year. And what was an ex-girlfriend? Chapter 344. Elder Su didn't expect Jin Wan dared to speak like this. His face darkened in an instant. Mo Xiaozi knew he was in the wrong, so he didn't say anything because he had been involved in this matter with the Su family. Su Jilan was so angry that she didn't show her emotions, but her eyes were fixed on Jin Wan. Everyone. Seeing Su Jilan's restrained gaze, Mo Jingshan took Jin Wan's hand and stood up. His face was as calm as water, and he maintained his usual reserved modesty on certain occasions, but his eyes were cold. I'm sorry, Wan is pregnant now and is not suitable for such an occasion. It will affect her mood. I'll take her back to the room first. If Elder Su and Miss Su sincerely want to stay here for the New Year's Eve dinner, the Mo family welcomes you two to stay for the New Year's Eve dinner, but if you have other places to go, please take care. With that, he took Jin Wan's hand and turned upstairs. He didn't walk fast, but he didn't look back, without the slightest hesitation or courtesy. Jin Wan didn't say anything and obediently followed him. Compared with Su Jilan, who took the initiative to show her around the Mo family, she certainly preferred to have Mo Jingshan take her upstairs to have a look. And the atmosphere in the living room was really not good right now, so she didn't want to be entangled too much. Mo Jingshan's attitude was even colder than hers. This man did not restrain himself at all, and even clearly ignored the Su family, not even giving face to Mo Xiaozi and Wan Zhu. Especially Su Jilan. Su Jilan's face didn't show much emotion, but her eyes were cold. Wan Zhu and Mo Xiaozi didn't react for a moment. What did Mo Jingshan say just now? Jin Wan was pregnant. Jingshan. Wan Zhu immediately sat up from the sofa and was about to go to the stairs to ask, but the two of them had gone upstairs and didn't look back at all. At this time, Wan Zhu turned to look at Mo Xiaozi. Mo Xiaozi frowned, and his expression was not very satisfied. Elder Su had obviously come here with a purpose. He originally wanted Mo Jingshan to solve this matter by himself, but now he had walked away freely, leaving this mess to Wan Zhu. But Jin Wan's pregnancy was really unexpected. When Elder Su heard that Jin Wan was pregnant, his face darkened to the extreme. He was about to get up and take Su Jilan back, but Su Jilan pressed his hand hard. Grandpa, it's okay. Su Jilan lowered her eyes and said softly, Miss Ji is Jingshan's wife now. It's natural for him to be so protective of his wife. Our attitude was indeed a bit harsh. Jingshan doesn't owe me anything. Hearing this, Mo Xiaozi said, that's right. Talking about this kind of thing will only add to our troubles. If we can't become in-laws, the friendship between our Mo and Su families won't change. Elder Su, you should take it easy. Now that Jin Wan is pregnant, as her father, I can't say anything more. Wan Zhu smiled. Today is the spring festival in our country. Since we're having a reunion dinner together, let's be friendly and lively. Let's put the past behind us. Jilan's conditions are so good, and there are so many men who are even more outstanding than Jingshan pursuing her. Our son may look pleasing to the eye, but his personality is actually very dull. Even if we're together, we might not be happy. At this moment, Jin Wan was holding the hand of a certain great CEO Mo as they toured the second floor of the Los Angeles Mo family home. At the end of the corridor, they pushed open the balcony window and walked out. Immediately, they could see the Roman statues Su Jilan had mentioned earlier. They were indeed very old, and one look was enough to tell that they were very valuable. These Roman statues from the 1980s were enough to buy her entire studio. They were really not things that ordinary people could afford to collect. Part of the pavilion behind was covered in ice and snow, but there were still several quiet paths that had been cleaned up. Several European-style buildings and lofts were neatly arranged. Do you want to stay here tonight? Mo Jingshan's well-defined fingers threaded through her hair and touched her head. Sure, it doesn't matter where we stay. Anyway, this place is so big, and your mother seems to like me very much. There won't be any pressure staying here. Jinwan abruptly turned around and leaned against the balcony, raising her head to look at the tall man. No wonder grandfather specifically used your mother's matter to mock Dad. As expected, your parents' personalities are not on the same level, Mo Jingshan smiled. Then let's stay here for one night and leave tomorrow, and... All right. It got dark quickly. When Jinwan went downstairs with Mo Jingshan, she found that Elder Su and Su Jilan had not left. Elder Su and Mo Shaozi had just opened a bottle of good wine, and Su Jilan was pouring wine for them. The tense atmosphere in the afternoon seemed to have disappeared. Seeing Jinwan come downstairs, Wan Zhu immediately came up to her and asked eagerly, "Daughter-in-law, are you really pregnant?" Jinwan nodded. Less than 2 months. The doctor said the fetus was not very stable, so I didn't dare to tell you about it so early. It doesn't matter if the fetus is unstable. When I was pregnant with Jingshan, the fetus was also unstable. I just need to lie down and rest. Wan Zhu immediately looked at Mo Jingshan with a smile. No wonder you want to take Jinwan back to the room to rest. You are much more reliable than your father. You even know how to dote on your wife. When I was pregnant with you, I had a stomachache every day, but your father didn't care about anything except sending me to the hospital with a sullen face. He didn't even care about me. He was not considerate at all. Mo Shaozi, who had just clinked glasses with Elder Su and taken a sip of wine on the sofa, when Wan Zhu took Jinwan to sit down, she leaned close to Jinwan and whispered, "Miss Su and Elder Su won't go back tonight. They will stay here for the night. The Su family and the Mo family are old friends. What happened in the afternoon was a bit too hurtful to Elder Su. Tonight, let him have a few drinks with Jingshan's father to ease the relationship. If you don't like to face them, go back to the room with Jingshan after dinner. Don't worry about being polite. I understand." With such a reasonable mother-in-law, no matter how much she didn't like having New Year's Eve dinner with Su Jilan, Jinwan could bear it with a smile. It's all right. There's nothing I don't want to face. And it's not just a matter of politeness. I can distinguish between the host and the guest. Don't worry, I won't mind. Jinwan winked at her. Wan Zhu patted Jinwan's shoulder and winked at her. Chapter 345. After the reunion dinner, Wan Zhu urged Mo Jingshan to bring Jinwan back to the room. Even Jinwan herself could tell that Mo Jingshan's mother didn't intend to let her sit at the same dining table with the Su family for too long. She used the excuse that Jinwan needed more rest during her pregnancy to urge her. After returning to the room, Jinwan took a look at the time. It was still morning in China. She sent New Year's greetings to all her colleagues in the studio and then called Ji Hongwen. After learning that there was still no news from Ji Mengran, she accompanied Ji Hongwen for a few words. After hanging up the phone, Jinwan felt uncomfortable that she could not rush back to accompany Ji Hongwen for the new year. She did not know how he would deal with Shinharu's matter, but the Ji family must be very cold this year. She turned to enter the bathroom and soaked for a long time. When she was about to fall asleep, she suddenly heard the door open. She turned to see that Mo Jingshan had entered. She was still in a daze when he carried her out of the bathtub. "You didn't continue chatting with Dad and Elder Su?" Jinwan's body was wet. She was afraid that she would wet his clothes, but seeing that he did not seem to mind, she did not resist. Before she was carried out of the bathroom, she grabbed a towel by the side and wrapped it around herself, lest she was carried out naked. It's getting late. It's more important to accompany you. Mo Jingshan carried her to the bed, lowered his head, and kissed her lips. His dark gaze fell on her collarbone and shoulders that were still wet. He closed his eyes and restrained himself before lifting a corner of the towel to help her dry her dripping hair. In the end, Jin Wan sat on the bed and obediently allowed Mo Jingshan to dry her hair. She held her chin with one hand and looked at the balcony by the side of the room. Mrs. Wan Zhu is really a good mother-in-law. When you were engaged to Su Jilan, was she also this good to Miss Su? Mo Jingshan's long and slender fingers ran through her hair. He said calmly, at least it was much better than our current estranged relationship. Now, in the face of such a huge emotional gap in all aspects, Miss Su is still able to persevere in having a reunion dinner with us here. It's really admirable. But your mother is really a good person. She's definitely a mother-in-law with a high EQ. Before coming back here, I didn't expect to have such a mother-in-law. I thought that except for grandfather Mo, no one else in the Mo family likes me. Mo Jingshan's eyes lit up. Don't worry, grandfather Mo Jingshan's gaze was calm and distant. He touched her dry hair and put the hairdryer aside. His palm landed on her shoulder, saying, because she knows that my wife is you, and I am indeed her son. She knows in her heart who she should side with. Jin Wan thought about Mo Jingshan's mother's actions today. She was extremely considerate towards outsiders and especially biased towards her family. And she was indeed a mother-in-law who knew what she was doing. It was not yet midnight. The servant said that there were fruit platters, candies, and snacks downstairs. Jin Wan had been in a lot of trouble since she became pregnant. Today, the problem of gluttony of pregnant women was highlighted. While Mo Jingshan was taking a shower, she pushed open the door and was about to go downstairs to get some snacks. As soon as she went out, she heard some noise at the staircase. She and Mo Jingshan lived on the 3rd floor. As soon as she came to the 2nd floor, she saw Su Jilan standing at the staircase. She seemed to be passing by, but she clearly wasn't. Su Jilan also glanced at her and then looked behind Jin Wan, only to find that Mo Jingshan didn't come out with her. She didn't see him. Miss Ji, you're pregnant. Congratulations. Su Jilan leaned against the railing and stared at Jin Wan. Jin Wan didn't expect Su Jilan to suddenly say this. She stopped. Jin Wan had heard more than once that Su Jilan had mania, so she instinctively didn't approach her but stood half a floor away from her on the stairs. Miss Su, why aren't you resting at this late hour? I can't sleep. Seeing that Jin Wan deliberately kept a distance from her, Su Jilan moved her eyebrows slightly, raised her feet, and walked towards Jin Wan step by step. Seeing her come up like this, Jin Wan didn't think she would do anything so blatantly. Besides, mania, which was an uncontrollable emotion, usually had a temporary reason, but Su Jilan looked too calm now. But Jin Wan still instinctively walked to the other side until she could hold the railing. She put her hand on the railing and put some strength on it, lest any accident happened. I hope my grandfather's words didn't hurt you today. When Su Jilan approached her, she said, Miss Ji, please be magnanimous and don't take it to heart. After leaving the hospital that day, I actually thought about it a lot. Since Jingshan has chosen you, this marriage is already a very legal fence. Besides, you are pregnant. This is a responsibility for Jingshan. At this point, I can't do anything even if I want to. Although I'm still a little unwilling, I can understand. Su Jilan's tone was natural and her expression was sincere. Unfortunately, Jin Wan could hear the aggressiveness in her words, which seemed to be a concession. Was Su Jilan saying that Mo Jingshan was just a shackle of marriage and a responsibility he had to bear? I think Miss Su may have grown up in the United States, so you still don't know the proper usage of some Chinese words. The word understand can't be used in this way. Jin-won smiled lightly. There are many things that don't need to be repeated. Miss Sue, you know in your heart whether the fence in front of you is our marriage or whether you have never really entered it, so how can you talk about breaking the fence? Soo Jilan looked at her, and her eyes gradually turned cold. She finally regained her pride, and the coldness on her face showed that she was deeply hurt by Jin-won's words. Furthermore, Miss Sue, since you've investigated me, you should know that Chairman Mo isn't particularly satisfied with me. However, under these circumstances, when Elder Sue questioned me this afternoon, he chose to remain silent. It's obvious that he isn't very satisfied with you either. In terms of the Mo family alone, you've already been rejected. Jin-won's tone was cold and indifferent. She didn't deliberately highlight anything, but these honest words were the most hurtful. Soo Jilan stopped talking to her and suddenly turned to go downstairs. Jin-won looked at her back and didn't lift her hand from the railing until she was far away. She looked down at her slightly sweaty palm and couldn't help laughing. Chapter 346. Early the next morning, Jin-won got up early and accompanied Ms. Won-ju to the kitchen to study some desserts. She had heard from Mo Jingshin that his mother often studied health and was very good at all kinds of food. However, there were many servants at home, so she didn't need to do anything, but she still found opportunities to study all kinds of delicious food in the kitchen. Jin-won was helping to stir the eggs when she was suddenly fed a mouthful of peanut butter, which was sweet and fragrant. How does it taste? Won-ju looked at her with shining eyes, looking forward to her daughter-in-law's praise. Jin-won smiled and licked the remaining peanut butter from the corner of her lips. She smacked her lips and said, not fully satisfied, it's especially delicious. It's definitely the best peanut butter I've ever tasted in my life. Knowing that this little girl was just flattering her, Won-ju happily fed her another mouthful, and then turned to make the cake, saying, you and Jingshin have been living in the Yew Garden, haven't you? I'm familiar with Auntie Chin and know she's good at cooking. Are you used to it? Auntie Chin cooks very well, and I'm not picky. Won-ju looked at Jin-won stirring the eggs in the blender and asked with a smile, do you know how to cook? Jin-won paused, looked down at her barely professional cooking skills, and answered, I know a little, but I'm not very good at it. It's enough for me to be self-sufficient, but when Jingshin cooks, the food he cooks is much better than what I cook. Won-ju turned to look at her in surprise. Jingshin has cooked for you? Yes. My son is really biased. He has never cooked for me and his father even once in his life. Let alone food, he hasn't even drunk a cup of tea that he personally poured for us. Won-ju sighed as she said, if you hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known that he had such an ability. That's right. Jin-won, your son's ability is really great. Jin-won stayed in the Mo family until noon, occasionally chatting with Mo Jingshin's mother and learning how to make various kinds of coffee from the servants of the Mo family. When Elder Sue and Soo Jilan left, Jin-won didn't go out. Anyway, no one asked her to see them off, and she didn't bother to listen to what Soo Jilan had to say before she left. In the evening, Ms. Won-ju urged Jin-won to go back to her room for an afternoon nap. When she got up, it was already sunset. Originally, she thought they could have dinner here. After all, it was rare for them to have such a peaceful and leisurely moment. As soon as Mo Shaozi put down the phone, he informed the servants at home, prepare a few more sets of cutlery, the family will be here in a while. The servant responded and left. The hall suddenly fell into silence. Jin-won raised her eyebrows. Did they all come together? Miss Sue had just left at noon, and now Missin was coming in the evening. She abruptly turned to look at Mo Jingshin. The man standing beside her slowly put one hand into his trouser pocket. His thin lips curved into a cold smile. The Mo family is particularly lively this year. Nuan Nuan needs to rest now. A lively environment is not good for her. I'll take her away first. With that, he took Jin Wan's hand and turned to leave. He still walked away without any hesitation. Mo Xiaoze immediately frowned. Before he spoke, Wanzhu suddenly tugged at his arm, glared at him, and said in a low voice, "Aren't you clearly driving them away? The Su family came here on their own accord. What do you think of the Yin family? It's not easy for Jingshan to bring his daughter-in-law back to stay for a night during the new year. I've been coaxing Jin Wan to stay a few more days, but now you're driving them away." Mo Xiao's face suddenly turned cold, and his eyes were filled with anger. "Don't meddle in this kind of thing. The Yin family just came to visit. Jin Wan is pregnant. What else can I do? You know Nuan Nuan is pregnant. Then why did you drag these people to her? You're on good terms with the Yin family, but Nuan Nuan is pregnant with our own grandson. Don't you know who's close?" The black Bentley drove out of the Mo family's villa in Los Angeles under the setting sun. Mo Jingshan's well-defined fingers gripped the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead, indifferent and clear, with a hint of coldness. Jin Wan sat in the passenger seat and looked at the man's profile. "It's getting dark. Where are we going?" She had been in the hospital for a long time since she came to Los Angeles. In the 2 days after she was discharged, she stayed at 11 Base and stayed at the Mo family's home. Jin Wan felt that she might have to stay in a hotel with him tonight. The man didn't answer her. After a moment of silence, he said in a low, indifferent voice, "You didn't eat much at noon. Do you want to eat out tonight, or do you want me to cook for you when we go back?" "Go back." "Go back to where?" Jin Wan was confused. He said, "I've been in Los Angeles for so long. I can't not have a place of my own." "Oh, you haven't been back for so long. Can you move in? There will be someone to clean it every day. You can move in at any time. I mean, I don't think there are any ingredients at home." Jin Wan's mouth was really spoiled by Mo Jingshan. Between going to a restaurant for dinner and going home to eat the food he cooked, she would definitely choose the latter. The black Bentley stopped in the parking lot of a large American supermarket chain. Mo Jingshan took a look at the time and said, "Go buy it. If it's too late, just buy the ingredients today and eat out. You can put the food in the fridge and cook it tomorrow. There's still time." All right. In fact, it was really late. It had been more than 50 minutes since they drove from the Mo family's home. She still didn't know where Mo Jingshan lived in Los Angeles. However, Mo Jingshan was obviously not in a good mood. Perhaps Mo Xiao's attitude just now annoyed him. She didn't say much, unfastened her seatbelt, got out of the car, and followed him to the supermarket. The two bought a lot of ingredients and fruits. Mo Jingshan also helped her get a box of maternity milk powder from the shelf. All kinds of things were piled up in the shopping cart. If Jin Wan hadn't stopped him, he would have looked at other nutrition and pregnancy essentials in the maternity section. She finally took him to the cashier to pay the bill. When they were about to go to the parking lot, Mo Jingshan put his arm around her shoulder and took her to the apartment across the road that was more than 80 stories high. Jin Wan didn't react at first. She wanted to say that he was carrying so many things in that hand. Was he not going to drive? Chapter 347. She didn't expect that Mo Jingshan's residence in Los Angeles was near the most prominent landmark in Los Angeles. She returned to his home many years ago and entered the door. The purely masculine facilities showed that he had lived here alone for a long time. It was getting late. Mo Jingshan told Jin Wan the direction of the bedroom, bathroom, and study, picked out the ingredients in the shopping bag, and methodically put the rest into the refrigerator. Then he washed a peach and handed it to the woman who had just finished shopping here. "I don't have your clothes here. Go to the closet and find a shirt to wear after taking a shower." Jean took the peach and took a bite. Her mouth was full, and she answered with a smile, "Okay, do you need my help?" "There's no need. Just wait here obediently." "Okay." Jean wandered around his place again. When she went to the kitchen with the peach pit, she saw that the man's sleeves were rolled up, and his tall and slender back was washing various ingredients by the sink. She pursed her lips, threw the peach pit away, and tiptoed over to hug him from behind. However, as soon as her hand reached out, the man suddenly said indifferently, "Do you like it here or High City?" Jean paused, then chuckled, reached out to hug him, and pressed against his back. "Do you have eyes on the back of your head?" Mo Jingshan didn't look back, let her hold him, and continued to wash his vegetables. "I like any place where you are, but relatively speaking, I'm used to living in High City, and there aren't so many things to do. There are still a lot of things waiting for me in the studio. If I can go back to High City earlier, I'll definitely choose to go back earlier. Shine Group will hold a Chinese New Year's dinner party in 4 days. We'll go back after the dinner." "So soon? My injuries are no longer serious. There's no need to stay here for too long." Jean rubbed her face against the man's back. "Don't worry about me. You have a lot of things to do in the United States. The MO Corporation is very stable. If Dad insists on letting you take over Shine, you'll have to come to the United States sooner or later. I can't tie you to High City for the rest of your life. I don't mind being tied to you anywhere." The man dried his hands, turned back, and patted her on the head. "Stand aside. I'll cut the vegetables." With that, he began to cut the vegetables. It was just the movement of cutting vegetables, but it was so smooth and handsome that people couldn't take their eyes off it. Jean looked at his profile and movements, pursed her lips, and did not speak for a while. She did like High City. But she didn't forget that Mo Jingshan belonged to Shine, either in this life or in this life. Although there was no difference between taking over earlier and a few years later, many things had changed dramatically in her 2 lives. She wondered if it was too selfish of her to change Mo Jingshan's original life in the way she wanted it to be. Ji didn't seem to be able to help him. "You High City. Mo-G-T High G in Wan Jingshan Mo Shint. Hi Shin Shao Hai Mo-G-T Angelus T to say's time to say. Angelus G's Angelus. Ming no G was. Shao Hai Angelus Can she washed her hands, turned on the TV, and changed several channels out of boredom. Finally, she found a music station to listen to music, and then went to fetch the tableware. Mo Jingshan said he was in a hurry tonight and only cooked a few dishes, but he still made several dishes, all of which were Jean Wan's favorites. After dinner, it was past 9:00 in the evening. After dinner, Jean Wan walked around the room twice and made a glass of the pregnant milk powder he bought for her. As she drank, she said, "I heard that pregnant milk powder will make you fat. Are you going to feed me into a ball in the first few months of my pregnancy?" Mo Jingshan smiled and gave her a new shirt. "I'm going to have a video conference. Take a shower if you're tired. Go to bed early." When Jean Wan came out of the shower, Mo Jingshan was still in the study. It sounded like he was still in a meeting, dealing with some sudden problems in High City. After listening outside the study for a while, Jean Wan quietly turned back to the bedroom and didn't go in to disturb him. Late at night, Mo Jingshan came out of the study and went to the bedroom. The bedroom was very quiet. Jean Wan was wearing a white men's shirt and sleeping soundly. Her cell phone was still in her hand. He took it and took a look at it, knowing that she was texting Xia Tian before going to bed. In addition to asking Xia Tian who she was in love with, she also asked Xia Tian 3 times in a row if she was with the scumbag who hit her. The content of a woman's chat was different from that of a man's, and there were all kinds of sweetness and shyness in it. In her sleep, Jin Wan was suddenly hugged. She opened her eyes in a daze, saw it was Imo Jingshan, and subconsciously burrowed into his arms. The man's low voice was against her ear. "What did you dream of?" Jin Wan smiled innocently in his arms and said hoarsely, "I dreamed of my previous life. I was lying motionless in prison, and then you suddenly appeared." The space instantly fell into a strange silence. Mo Jingshan took the cell phone from her hand and threw it on the bedside table. He lowered his eyes to look at the woman who was half asleep and still thought she was in a dream. He looked at her fair face with his deep and shallow eyes. Jin Wan suddenly woke up. She realized what she had just said and shrank back into his arms. Avoiding the man's probing gaze, she said in an indistinct voice, "Back when I was studying in T-City, I would randomly read some novels when I couldn't sleep at night. After reading too many novels about the fate of several lifetimes, would often dream of these messy things. I even dreamed that you and I were immortals in the past. I even dreamed that you were an emperor and I was a concubine. Then, I was bullied by you every day. Prison, that was the first time I dreamed of it. I might have really been poisoned by those illogical novels." She vaguely explained a few more words, buried her head in his arms, and pretended to sleep again. It was just a dream, and he shouldn't take it too seriously. Mo Jingshan's breath lingered in her hair and neck, and there was a faint warmth that tickled her heart. She couldn't fall asleep for a while. A moment later, she heard the man's low voice by her ear. "What do I look like in your dream?" Had she been discovered pretending to be asleep? Chapter 348. But he asked, what was that him like? Jin Wan's hand was pressed against the man's chest, her heart beating abnormally, and she was really immersed in that dream. In the dream, the man who suddenly rushed in the moment she fell to the ground with blood dripping from the corner of her mouth was not much different from him now, except that his hair was shorter and finer than it was now. 10 years had not left any trace on his body at all. She couldn't see his expression clearly in the dream, just like how she couldn't touch him in those 10 years. He was very far away and unreachable. Jin Wan answered gloomily in his arms, "Anyway, he's handsome." The man's slender fingers suddenly straightened her face, his forehead pressed against hers, and he said hoarsely, "Really?" Jin Wan suddenly didn't dare to look into his eyes. She glanced at him and hurriedly nodded. "Really?" Mo Jingshan pinched her chin, lowered his head, and kissed her. When he was done, he purposely bit down on her lips and licked the corner of her lips. "Do I kiss you like this in your dreams?" Jin Wan, of course not. That him was someone she couldn't even see if she wanted to. She pressed her back against the bed, closed her eyes, and turned her back to him, answering vaguely, "Anyway, I'm not as naughty as you are now. I'm going to sleep. Aren't you sleepy? I'll hold you to sleep." He was behind her, holding her in his arms. Shine Group's cooperation dinner was held 4 days later, which was equivalent to the 5th day of the year according to the Chinese New Year. After all, it was a Chinese company, and it had many connections with many Chinese companies, so it was indeed very suitable to hold a dinner party on this day. In addition to the cooperation of various companies, such a dinner party was also held because of the New Year's atmosphere, so it was not too serious. There was a lot of food and drinks. Because Jin Wan was pregnant, she didn't wear a tight dress, but bought a loose doll dress suitable for the dinner party. She tried on a white chiffon dress. She originally wanted to wear high heels, but Mo Jingshan refused. She was not allowed to wear high heels because she was pregnant, so she had to change into a pair of flats. Tonight's banquet, Nan Heng was also present. Feng Ling was also present. She didn't wear a formal dress but still wore that cool, black outfit. As soon as Jin Wan saw Feng Ling, she asked Mo Jingshan to greet the executives of those companies first, so that he wouldn't have to worry about whether she was suitable for the smell of alcohol and refuse others' toasts every time. "Mrs. Mo, why don't you go with CEO Mo?" Seeing Jin Wan suddenly come over, Feng Ling asked in confusion. "He's already introduced me to everyone, but it's really inconvenient for him to take care of me all the time. I said I wanted to come over to chat with you, so he let me come over." Jin Wan blinked at her and then glanced at Nan Heng. At the same time, Jin Wan felt the man's eyes on her. She turned around and saw that Mo Jingshan had come over. "Feng Ling, keep an eye on Madam." Mo Jingshan suddenly took a look at Feng Ling as he took Jin Wan's hand. Feng Ling knew very well what the two young ladies of the Su family would do. The moment she saw Su Jilan and Su Shui, she instinctively raised her guard. She nodded. The red carpet in the banquet hall was in the middle, and there were many ways to go, but Su Jilan seemed to deliberately pass here. She pulled Su Shui, who looked panic-stricken, to this side. When they passed by Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan, many people around them looked at them gossiping, wondering if there would be any sparks between Mo Jingshan's ex-fiancée and his current wife. Being glanced at by so many people, Jin Wan forced herself to look away, ignoring their boring gazes, and only looked at Su Shui. Chapter 349. Especially when she suddenly saw Jin Wan, Su Shui seemed to be stimulated. She stared at her with red eyes, turned around, and came straight to Jin Wan. Before Jin Wan could see what was going on with Su Shui, Mo Jingshan had quietly pulled her behind him, and his tall and straight figure stood in front of her. "Jin Wan. Why are you here?" Su Shui stared at Jin Wan as if she couldn't see anyone else. Su Shui was about to step forward, when Mo Jingshan's low, cold voice rang. "Elder Su, what do you mean?" "Since Shui was frightened last time, she has been locked up at home. Isn't it the spring festival? We can't let the child stay in her room all day. Jilan has the best relationship with her, so she took Shui here to relax while it's busy here. Shui's mental illness also needs to be exercised in crowded places. Maybe it will get better," Elder Su said with a smile. Mental illness. Jin Wan didn't expect Su Shui's current state to be a sign of mental illness, but Su Shui could call out her name just now. Could it be that Mo Jingshan or Nan Heng did something to Su Shui after that incident? Revenge must exist, but what kind of fright and revenge did she suffer to become like this? Su Shui had lost at least 10 pounds, and her face was pale. She looked frightened and couldn't be provoked at all. She didn't look like she was pretending at all. Obviously, she was really ill. Jin Wan didn't step forward. She just stood over Mo Jingshan's shoulder and looked thoughtfully at Su Shui, whose eyes were getting redder and redder as she stared at her. "All right, Shui, Miss Ji is also here to attend the party. It's all over. She won't do anything to you anymore. Don't be afraid." Su Jilan took Su Shui's hand and coaxed her in a gentle voice, like a good sister who doted on her cousin very much. But in an instant, the people around were a little surprised. No one knew how Su Shui became like this, but it seemed that it was all because of Jin Wan that Su Shui became so pitiful. Su Shui was afraid of Jin Wan. Putting aside how powerful the Su family's background was, Su Shui was the young lady of the Swan group. Of the Su family's daughters, one was robbed of her man, and the other was so frightened that she developed a mental illness. And it was all because of Jin Wan. For a moment, the people around them looked at Jin Wan with a strange look in their eyes. Jin Wan glanced expressionlessly at Su Jilan, who was pulling Su Shui into the crowd. She really didn't expect that she would bring Su Shui to such a place. What was the point of beating around the bush? Mo Jingshan's hand tightened, as if to comfort her. Nuan, Xian, said, Jilan, Xuan, and Xuan, Su, and Yan, Mo, Su, Nuan Ji, Su Xian Chui Ji, Nuan, Ji, Su, Ji, Nuan. Nuan, Mo, Nuan Su, Ji, Xian, Ji, Su, Nuan, Ji, and Shui Ji, Xian, Su, Ji, Jingshan. Mo Jingshan tightened his grip on her hand and looked back at her. Let's leave early for the party tonight. We won't stay here for long, and Jin Wan nodded subconsciously. Feng Ling, who was standing by her side, said in a low voice that only she and Mo Jingshan could hear, Su Shui planned the kidnapping of you in T-City. She used to have connections with the underworld forces behind the Su family, so she was very bold and dared to cooperate with that kind of underground bar. After she was forcibly sent back to the United States, Nanheng sent Kei to teach her a lesson, and then she became like this. Jin Wan turned to meet Mo Jingshan's eyes and then to Feng Ling. What did Kei do to Su Shui? They just copied what she did at that time. They drugged her, kidnapped her, beat her, threatened her, and sold her to an underground bar in the United States. She was bought by 3 tall and strong black men and was tortured by them for several days. When the Su family begged the police to save her, Su Shui was almost at her last breath. That terrible scene appeared in Jin Wan's mind again. If Mo Jingshan hadn't come in time, she might have been killed. What would have happened? Would she have been raped and then committed suicide, or would she have been sold to countless people because she didn't even have the strength to commit suicide? Su Shui suffered such a fate because of herself. Since Kei and the others only copied what she did, she could only blame herself. However, after being frightened and being tortured by the 3 black men for a few days, it was not surprising that Su Shui had become this absent-minded and emaciated appearance. The Su family had gone far away. Mo Jingshan held Jin Wan's hand and put her by his side, not leaving. When the banquet was at its climax, there was a burst of laughter and applause. It seemed that Mo Shaozi was drinking and talking with several partners. Jin Wan saw many people around her were applauding, so she also raised her hand and clapped. She looked around the crowd but didn't see Su Shui and Su Jilan. Perhaps Su Shui's condition was too bad, and Su Jilan had succeeded in tricking Jin Wan with Su Shui's excuse, so she had taken Su Shui away. Everyone raised their glasses and drank together. Jin Wan didn't drink tonight because she was pregnant, but Mo Jingshan just smiled and held her hand calmly. This man was really good-looking, especially when he smiled. The banquet went well. In the second half of the banquet, Jin Wan touched her belly. She had to go to the bathroom frequently during her pregnancy. She said, Jingshan, I'm going to the bathroom. At this time, a partner was talking with Mo Jingshan, and it was not convenient for Mo Jingshan to go to the ladies' room. He patted her hand and motioned for her to go to Feng Ling. Let Feng Ling accompany you. Okay. Jin Wan turned and went to Feng Ling. When she was about to go over, she suddenly saw that Nanheng was pushing Feng Ling into a corner of the banquet hall. In the darkness of the corner, there seemed to be something ambiguous. Jin Wan, it didn't seem appropriate to go there. She glanced over there and then at the bathroom just a few steps behind her. On the other side, Feng Ling had just come out of the shackles of Nanheng. She looked at the banquet hall expressionlessly, only to find that Jin Wan, who had been following Mo Jingshan, was gone. Chapter 350. Just as Feng Ling was feeling suspicious, suddenly, a scream came from the bathroom not far away. Ah, the scream didn't sound like Jean Wan, but it was drowned out by the bustling banquet hall. Only Feng Ling, who had just walked nearby, could hear it clearly. Feng Ling walked quickly to the women's bathroom and was about to push it open, only to find that the door was locked from the inside. "Mrs. Mo. Are you in there?" Feng Ling frowned warily, pressed against the door, and asked in a low voice. It was quiet inside, and no one answered. Even the person who screamed just now was silent. Feng Ling suddenly raised her foot and kicked the door hard. The loud crash startled everyone in the banquet hall. As the lock of the bathroom door was kicked down, Feng Ling quickly pushed the door open and searched inside with her sharp eyes, but there was no one in the bathroom. The scream just now was not Jean Wan, but the things scattered on the floor of the bathroom were Jean Wan's. A sharp pain came from her neck. Jean Wan frowned and slowly opened her eyes in a daze. The first thing she saw was Su Shui holding a fruit knife with a crazed look in her eyes, pressing the sharp side of the knife against her neck. The pain and coldness on her neck gradually woke Jean Wan up. She was about to shrink back when Su Shui moved the knife back with her. "What are you doing?" Jean Wan's head hurt. For a moment, she couldn't remember how she was drugged, but Su Shui's eyes looked crazy. Her hair stood on end because of the other party's eyes. "Jean Wan, you finally fell into my hands." Su Shui widened her eyes and stared at the faint trace of blood on Jean Wan's white neck. As if stimulated by something more bloodthirsty, she smiled grimly and pressed the fruit knife harder against her carotid artery. "You ruined me. I'm going to kill you. Jean Wan. I'm going to kill you." Jean Wan felt that she was still under the effects of the drug and did not have much strength. However, she saw that Su Shui's hand that was holding the knife was trembling. She slowly raised her hand tentatively. While Su Shui was focused on pressing the knife into her neck, she abruptly raised her hand and used all her strength to hold on to her wrist. She then used some strength to force her wrist open and took the opportunity to snatch the knife away. Su Shui watched the opportunity to kill her disappear. She froze for a moment, looked at her empty hands, glared at Jean Wan coldly, and raised her hands to strangle her neck. "Jean Wan, I want you to die. Su Shui, wake up." Jean Wan avoided her hand and raised her arm to push her away. She turned to look at the scene outside the window, and her eyelids twitched. What was going on? Why were they in the car? Outside the car window, it looked like a highway. Both sides of the road were barren, and there was nothing. Suddenly being shouted at by Jean Wan, Su Shui stared at her, trembling all over. "Do you think you can still hurt me?" "Jean Wan, even if you want to kill me, I'll die with you. I'll kill you first." Hearing this, Jean Wan suddenly turned to look at Su Shui's crazy eyes. "You didn't drug me." Su Shui acted as if she had heard a joke. "You're still pretending. You relied on your ability to pretend to be innocent to make Mo Jingshan fall for you, didn't you? It was you who drugged me. Fortunately, I woke up early. Fortunately, I put a knife in my bag before I went to the party. I can take your life anytime, anywhere." Not Su Shui, they were both drugged at the same time. Su Shui said and was about to pounce on her again. Jean Wan frowned and waved her away. "Calm down first." While holding Su Shui's wrist, she looked up at the car. It was a new BMW speeding on the highway. She and Su Shui were in the back of the car, and there was a glass or thick plastic partition between them and the driver's seat in front of the car, so they couldn't see who was driving. Judging from the scene outside the window, the speed of the car was at least more than 150 miles per hour. Why were they drugged and brought into this car at the same time? Jean Wan raised her hand and pressed her forehead. She remembered that when she went to the bathroom, she happened to see Su Shui in there. At that time, Su Shui was standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom and applying lipstick. She looked at Jin Wan through the mirror as if there was an abyss in her eyes that was about to swallow Jin Wan. Her eyes were very strange, revealing the same madness and hatred as now. Jin Wan only took 2 steps in and subconsciously wanted to retreat. She didn't want to be in the same place with such a mentally unstable person. However, before she went out, 2 women suddenly ran in behind her who were eager to go to the bathroom. She didn't see them clearly, but she did want to go to the bathroom at that time, and there was only one bathroom on that floor. Seeing that she and Su Shui were not alone here, Jin Wan avoided Su Shui and went to the door a little farther on the other side. When she came out of the cubicle in the bathroom, Su Shui had disappeared. Then Jin Wan went to wash her hands. As soon as she put her hands under the water, she suddenly heard a scream from the soundproof door nearest her. The voice sounded very much like Su Shui's. She shivered all over and instinctively turned to walk out. At that moment, the cubicle door behind her was opened with a bang, and someone rushed out. Before Jin Wan could get out of the bathroom, she was dragged back, and the door of the bathroom was locked by the 2 strong women. A wet cloth covered Jin Wan's mouth and nose, and the pungent smell made her more and more dazed until she lost consciousness. Everything happened in just 2 or 3 seconds, and she couldn't react at all. But she never expected that she and Su Shui would be drugged and taken away at the same time. Listen. Now is not the time to be crazy. Jin Wan looked out of the window at the highway and the deserted hills and rivers on both sides of the road, and said solemnly, "We may have been kidnapped at the same time. Who asked you to go to the party? Did Su Jilan invite you to go to the party with her, or did you unilaterally take the initiative to go with her?" Su Shui stared at Jin Wan. "Are you trying to drive a wedge between me and my cousin?" Chapter 351. Seeing Jin Wan's cold and serious eyes, Su Shui was more or less shaken. Her slightly pale lips trembled before she reluctantly said, "Seeing that I've been locked up by my family for too long, my cousin's heart aches for me. She said she would take me out to relax." With that, she suddenly glared at Jin Wan. "Don't try to sow discord between us. I'm very close to my cousin. Even if there was a kidnapping, it would have nothing to do with her." She was stupid. She didn't know that she had been used once, and now she was being used a second time. She didn't know how powerful her cousin was. If they really had a good relationship, Su Jilan would have stopped Su Shui from going to T-City to court her death from the very beginning. If it weren't for Su Jilan's pitiful instigation, Su Shui, who was impulsive, wouldn't have been bold enough to run into Mo Jingshan's gun. And today, if Su Jilan didn't have a purpose, she wouldn't have taken Su Shui, who was so crazy, to the party. There was no way she could reason with a lunatic like this. Being driven at such a terrifying speed, Jin Wan felt nauseous again. She didn't know if the drug had stimulated her, but from the moment she woke up, a certain part of her stomach had been throbbing in pain. Jin Wan suppressed the panicky feeling of weightlessness, waved away Su Shui's hand that was about to pinch her shoulder, and patted the partition between her and the driver's seat. It was a layer of black glass and plastic, which should not be particularly strong. Jin Wan patted it again, then looked down at the flat shoes on her feet, and then at the high heels on Su Shui's feet. She decisively bent down and took off her shoes. "What are you doing?" Su Shui's eyes were instantly filled with vigilance because of Jin Wan's strange action. Jin Wan ignored her, raised the strong heel of her shoe, and smashed it hard on the partition in front of her. Now the car was driving at such a terrible speed, and there were cars of all sizes on both sides from time to time, and she found that the car had been driving in a straight line. She had to find a way to stop the car. The heavy thud startled Su Shui and made her shrink aside. For a moment, she didn't know what to do with Jin Wan's neck. Jin Wan knew that for a person like Su Shui who was stimulated and a little crazy, such noise would affect her mood, so she just silently banged on the partition and didn't ask her any more questions. Now was not the time to bicker. The two of them were in the same boat. If something happened, both of them would either die or be injured. Jin Wan smashed the partition hard several times, and a crack finally appeared in the middle. Jin Wan's hand was a little numb, so she continued to smash it with the other hand. When a huge hole was smashed in the middle of the partition, Jin Wan did not feel any joy or relief, but her heart sank in an instant. There was no one in front of the car. The car was actually driverless. From the time they were thrown into the car to the time they woke up, at least 10 minutes had passed. The car had been driving at a speed of 150 miles per hour. It was common to see a highway without any detours in the United States, but it was definitely not that simple to maintain the speed of the car with the two of them in it. Now, do you still believe in your cousin? Jin Wan stared at the empty driver's seat and asked in a low voice. Su Shui looked shocked and didn't understand. What did the driverless car have to do with her relationship with Su Jilan? Someone wants to use you to get rid of me, but they don't intend to let you live at all. Su Shui, you're really poor. You've done a lot of things for your cousin since you were a child, but in the end, it must be you who bear the responsibility. And your good sister, who is always protected by you, has always been like a cold blue lotus, untainted by the mud, hasn't she? Jin Wan gave her a sarcastic look. Su Shui sat stiffly in the back as if she hadn't understood Jin Wan's words. He was stupid enough to begin with. Now that he had gone crazy, it was even more incomprehensible. Jin Wan withdrew her gaze from her and quickly smashed the hole in front of her with the heel of her shoe until most of the partition was smashed down. Then she crawled forward to the driver's seat and raised her hand to control the steering wheel, only to find that not only was the car's speed fixed, but even the steering wheel was locked. She couldn't control the direction at all, let alone brake. Both the brakes and clutch were loose and completely useless. Jin Wan lowered her head and looked down, only to find that the car had been modified. Several places under the seat had clearly been tampered with. She saw several thick red, yellow, blue, and green lines crisscrossing under the seat, and for a moment, she felt a chill down her spine. Could it be that this car was installed with a self-ignition system? Noticing Jin Wan's pale face, Su Shui immediately trembled and leaned on the seat behind her. Can you stop the car? Jin Wan glanced at her silently. Rather than saying that Su Jilan was manic, it was better to say that Su Jilan was a person who would do anything to achieve her goals. Her cousin, who was always considerate of her, was used by her to such an extent. Now, in order to get rid of her, she was even willing to sacrifice Su Shui's life. If they really died in this car, no one would consider whether Su Jilan was the culprit. Because everyone knew that Su Shui and Jin Wan had a grudge, and they also knew that Su Shui hated Jin Wan. They also knew that Su Shui was crazy, and a lunatic could do anything terrible. So, such a crazy and terrible act of mutual destruction could only be done by Su Shui, who was already crazy. By then, Su Shui would be dead, and there would be no evidence. While successfully eradicating her rival in love, she could also be cleared of suspicion. Feng Ling had said that Su Jilan was not simple. Sure enough, she was not simple. Jin Wan glanced at the wires hidden under the car. Her and Su Shui's bags were gone, and there were no scissors or other tools at hand. It was impossible for high-heeled shoes to break such thick wires, and it was impossible for her hands to break them. The wires were not so long that they couldn't be pulled up and broken. Jin Wan raised her hand and moved the steering wheel a few more times, but there was nothing she could move. She looked at the car again, which had been set at 150 miles per hour, and then looked out the window at the scenery of the road that kept moving backward at a terrifying speed. From time to time, cars flew past or were overtaken by the car. Even if there was no end to this straight highway, even if the car could slowly stop when the fuel ran out, if the car was really installed with a self-ignition system, it could explode at any time. Maybe in a minute, maybe in half an hour, unknown danger could happen at any time. Should she jump out of the car? Jump out of the car at 150 miles per hour. Chapter 352. Jean Wan covered her aching belly with her hand, and her eyes gradually turned red. If she jumped like this, even if she didn't die, she would be hurt, not to mention she was pregnant. The other party really gave her a big problem. Jean Wan, why are you sitting here? Stop the car. Why don't you stop the car? Several cars passed by at a strange speed, making people panic. Su Shui screamed from behind, "Are you trying to kill me? Stop the car. Get out of the car if you want to live. This car can't be stopped." Jean Wan didn't bother to explain too much to her. She raised her hand and tried the car doors. As expected, they were all locked. Fortunately, the car was on land and not under water pressure. If there was no water pressure, she could use a sharp object to break the car window. Jean Wan knocked Su Shui's high-heeled shoes on the car window several times. Her arms, which had been a little numb, were almost powerless now. She changed her hands to knock on the car window. In the end, she put on the high-heeled shoes that were a size larger than her feet, turned sideways on the seat, and kicked the car window hard with her foot. "What are you doing?" Su Shui looked at her strange actions blankly. "Don't talk so much nonsense." Jean Wan kicked the car window and turned to look at her. "If you want to live, come and help me open the car window." Su Shui shrank her neck. She didn't believe Jean Wan at all. The banging sound in the car made her even more panicked. Suddenly, she saw the fruit knife abandoned on the ground, picked it up, and pointed it at Jean Wan again. "If you don't stop the car quickly, I'll kill you now." Jean Wan glanced at her coldly and grabbed the fruit knife. Ignoring Su Shui's increasingly panicked and crazed eyes, she got up, put the fruit knife in the gap between the car window and the car door, and then smashed it with her high heels. Su Shui's eyes were cold. The car window was too strong. No wonder the other party had specially bought a new car to set up such a big conspiracy. All the windows of the new car basically had a smash-proof function. Jean Wan gritted her teeth and pulled out the metal bar on the passenger seat to knock on the window as she and Immo Jingshan had done when they had escaped underwater. The car window was damaged one after another, and finally there was a gap. Jean Wan slashed it again, cut open the seal with a fruit knife, and smashed it with her shoe until the whole car window was broken and fell down. Jean Wan lay on the car window and observed the wasteland on both sides of the highway. Ahead of her was a sunken hill. There was no water, and it was barren. She didn't know where it was. At a speed of 150 miles per hour, the moment the car window was opened, a gust of wind rushed in. Jean Wan narrowed her eyes and looked around. Suddenly, she turned and said, "Su Shui, come here." Su Shui's face was filled with fear as the strong wind blew in, and she shook her head vigorously. Jean Wan lost her patience and reached out to tug at her. "Your cousin wants to harm you. Are you really going to let her have her way? Although we might get hurt, we have to jump to survive." "Jump? I don't want it. I'll definitely die if I jump at this speed. You really want to harm me?" Su Shui screamed and pushed her. Jean Wan tugged her hard. Since she couldn't reason with her, she had to use force. Just as the two of them were fighting, Jinwan suddenly seemed to hear the sound of a siren. She turned her head abruptly and looked at the wires under the seat. The siren sounded frightening. She tightened her grip and pulled Su Shui to the open window. "Jump." "I don't want to jump." The two of them kept fighting, and Jinwan couldn't divert her attention to the huge truck that had been following this car. Su Shui was almost pushed out by Jinwan again and again. She didn't know where the brute force came from, but she suddenly grabbed Jinwan's neck and forced Jinwan to let go of her. Then she turned over and pressed Jinwan hard against the car door. Her eyes were red as she strangled Jinwan's neck and shouted, "If you want to die, die by yourself. Don't drag me. Go to hell, you've..." Jinwan was shocked to see the hatred in Su Shui's eyes. She wanted to wake her up, but her face was red and she couldn't speak. Just as she was about to be pushed out of the car window by Su Shui, half of Jinwan's body was exposed outside the window. Out of the corner of her eye, she finally saw the huge truck that had been following closely behind, and at the same time, she saw the black Bentley speeding up behind it. Bentley. A black Bentley. At this angle and speed, she couldn't see the license plate clearly, but the model of the car was so familiar to her that she frowned hard. Just as she was distracted, Su Shui pushed her out with force. Jinwan's back brushed against the remaining glass fragments of the car window. The pain made her lose the strength to resist. The moment she was pushed out, with the inertia of the speeding car and the speed at which she was thrown, she felt as if she was flying for 2 seconds and then fell heavily to the ground. At the moment of falling, Jinwan subconsciously covered her stomach with her hand, but her body rolled several times on the ground. Her limbs and bones were in so much pain that she almost lost consciousness. Almost at the same time, the huge truck rushed straight in her direction and even sped up. Hearing the sound, Jinwan raised her head with a jerk and looked at the huge truck that was about to rush towards her. The truck was coming straight for her. Even the escape route of jumping out of the car had been blocked. She didn't even have the last chance of survival. Despair and panic swamped her in an instant. At this critical moment, the black Bentley several meters behind the huge truck suddenly sped up. At the moment when Jinwan was about to be run over by the truck, the black Bentley rushed into her sight at an astonishing speed and decisively stood between her and the truck. Boom! There was a loud bang. In a trance, Jinwan seemed to see the license plate number of the black Bentley rushing over, and a string in her brain snapped with the loud crash. Don't! Jinwan's body was thrown to the side of the road by the impact of the two cars in front of her. After rolling several times, she couldn't control her body and hit hard against the safety fence on the side of the highway. She felt as if her abdomen was being torn apart, and waves of pain assaulted her. The cars in the rear slammed on the brakes one after another because of the terrible accident in front of them. With a series of breaking sounds, the world seemed to fall silent for an instant. Jinwan raised her eyes with some difficulty and looked at the black Bentley that was almost hit by the huge truck. Chapter 353. Jinwan's entire body trembled in pain. Her heart felt empty. She stared at the car, her hands struggling to crawl on the ground, but no matter how hard she tried, she could not move. The sharp, throbbing pain in her abdomen stimulated her nerves. Jingshan, in the distance, there was a loud explosion. There was no need to guess to know that the car Su Shui was in had self-ignited and exploded. The fire and thick black smoke covered the sky with a layer of fog. The highway was suddenly quiet and suffocating, and the smell of death slowly penetrated Jinwan's skin. Her tense and disordered nerves cooled down bit by bit, but she felt cold and bone-chilling. Jinwan had never felt the sky was so gloomy. The black Bentley stopped there motionlessly, and the gasoline under the car sprang up a small fire. Jinwan stared at the fire, gritted her teeth, and tried desperately to crawl over to put out the fire, but after a long time, she only moved a few centimeters forward. Mrs. Mo. Fong Ling's voice followed. A lot of drivers had gathered behind the giant truck. She quickly pushed the crowd away and ran in. When she saw Jean Wan lying on the ground with red eyes, she rushed over. Fong Ling crouched down to help Jean Wan up, but Jean Wan kept staring at the black Bentley and said hoarsely, "Who is the person in the car? Let me help you up first." Fong Ling almost never cried. Now seeing Jean Wan's blank eyes and the blood oozing from her lower body, her eyes almost turned red. She stepped forward and tried to help her up, but Jean Wan couldn't even stand steadily and just kept staring at the car. "Tell me, who is the person in the car?" Fong Ling gritted her teeth and didn't speak. Jean Wan slowly turned her eyes to Fong Ling. "Is it Mo Jingshan?" Fong Ling grabbed her arm to prevent her from falling, but her hand holding her arm trembled slightly. She tried to comfort her, but she couldn't suppress her emotions at all. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "Mr. Mo, and we have tracked your location and chased you all the way. We were half an hour behind you and finally caught up with you as fast as we could, but just now, when we saw you being pushed out of the car window, Mr. Mo's car suddenly accelerated to the limit." Jean Wan's mind went blank for a moment. The person in the car was Mo Jingshan. The moment her consciousness stopped, Jean Wan suddenly pushed Fong Ling away, turned around, and staggered in the direction of the car. Fong Ling didn't expect that she still had the strength to push herself away and stepped back. When she reached out to help her, Jean Wan had already rushed to the side of the black Bentley. She rushed forward to hold Jean Wan, who almost knelt on the ground, and held her arm tightly. "Mrs. Mo, don't do this." Jean Wan stared at the motionless Bentley in front of her and couldn't hear anything. Nanheng, who rushed into the crowd almost at the same time as Fong Ling, didn't say a word and directly asked Kay and the others to catch the driver of the giant truck. At the same time, a group of people were solemnly preparing to rescue him. The drivers around. And they pointed. In. "And did the car in front explode? Did you? Is it too scary? Look, the car and. MOG said. Shen. And. She have a handshake, I to say. And. The car is leaking oil. Look, the oil is on fire. Will this car explode too? The whispers of the crowd couldn't reach Jean Wan's ears. She held back her tears and stared at the broken window with bloodshot eyes. She tried to push Fong Ling away, but Fong Ling still held her arm tightly and finally hugged Jean Wan with both hands. "Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Let me go. Mrs. Mo. Fong Ling, let me go." Jean Wan screamed. "Let me go, this car may spontaneously combust at any time. Mr. Mo risked his life to rush here and block the way just to save your life. No matter what happens to Mr. Mo, if you don't leave now, won't Mr. Mo's sacrifice be in vain?" "Sacrifice what? How could he be sacrificed?" "He won't." Jean Wan struggled crazily in her arms and finally couldn't move. Hearing the sound of Nanheng and Fong Ling trying to open the door, she couldn't hold back her tears and knelt to the ground powerlessly. "Jean Wan." Fong Ling couldn't help calling her name. She lowered her head and saw Jean Wan's trembling and twitching shoulders. She held her shoulders and said calmly, "Your lower body is covered with blood. Get in the car first." "Jean Wan, don't be like this." Seeing the fire on the gasoline under the car getting bigger and bigger, Jean Wan wanted to go up and put it out. Nanheng suddenly looked at Jean Wan and said seriously, "Fong Ling, take Jean Wan away immediately." It was necessary to take Jean Wan away. With Nan Heng's order, Fengling forced Jin Wan up from the ground, put her arms around her shoulders, and took her hand. "Let's go." Jin Wan didn't speak or move. She just stared at the black Bentley and watched the blood spreading out along the door. She felt dizzy. "Mo Jingshan, come out, come out." Jin Wan's mind was blank. She unconsciously walked to the car door but was held down by Fengling. She stared blankly at the deformed car door. The airbag of a Bentley is better than that of many cars. "He'll be fine, right?" Jin Wan seemed to be talking to Fengling, but also seemed to be talking to the person in the car, and more like talking to herself. Fengling didn't say anything. No matter how good the car was, it was driven at the limit of its speed. If it was an ordinary car at this speed, it would have been smashed into pieces in an instant. The huge impact was not something a normal person could bear. Besides, Mr. Mo drove the car horizontally, and the side of the car was hit. The defense of the side was not as strong as that of the front and back of the car, so the situation inside the car was obviously no better than outside. It could only be worse than what they saw. At the moment when Jin Wan was almost crushed to death by the giant truck, Mr. Mo used his life to exchange for Jin Wan's. Just now, when he suddenly drove the car to the limit, no one could see this scene. Even though Fengling had been through fire and water for so many years and was used to death, she still couldn't forget the scene just now. Fengling held Jin Wan's hand, pulled her over, and was about to take her away. In fact, Jin Wan didn't have much strength, and the red and sticky lower body made her realize what she had lost at this moment. Why did this happen? Why did it suddenly become like this? Chapter 354. Fengling forcibly took Jin Wan back to the black SUV not far behind. As soon as she opened the door, there was a sudden noise. It sounded like the deformed car door was finally opened. Hearing the noise, Jin Wan froze, turned her eyes in that direction with a jerk, and turned to walk back. "Jin Wan, don't go over there. Mo Jingshan is there." "I heard them open the car door." Fengling held her and didn't let her move. In this situation, Mr. Mo was probably covered in blood. If Jin Wan went over in this state, she would probably suffer a big blow. "Fengling, let me go over." "Jin Wan. I beg you." Jin Wan finally could not hold it in any longer. She choked with sobs, and large drops of tears rolled down her battered and blood-stained face. She stared stubbornly in that direction. "Let me go see him." "I want to go see him." Fengling made up her mind and pulled Jin Wan back with force. Jin Wan's whole body bumped into her arms. Fengling was about to help her into the car when Jin Wan's whole body suddenly softened and she fell down. "Jin Wan." Fengling was startled and rushed to hold her steady. Fearing that something really happened to her, she helped her into the car. When she looked down and saw the blood on Jin Wan's lower body, she hurriedly took off her black coat and wrapped it around her lower body. Then she quickly contacted the nearest rescue team and emergency center. Fengling watched Jin Wan being pushed out of the car. A normal person would be hurt after being pushed out of a car at such a speed, let alone Jin Wan's stomach. Fengling didn't dare to think anymore. She held the phone in one hand and held Jin Wan's hand tightly with the other, but only felt a bone-chilling coldness. Jin Wan's blood seemed to be frozen. From her hands to her face to her neck, she was cold everywhere. She was still frowning in her coma and murmuring indistinctly. Listening carefully, she seemed to be calling Mo Jingshan's name. When Jin Wan woke up, she thought she just had a nightmare, but as soon as she moved, she felt pain all over, as if all her bones and flesh had been taken apart and reassembled. For a moment, she almost suspected that her rebirth was fake. Perhaps she had just returned to the despair and pain 10 years later. She stared blankly at the snow-white walls and ceiling of the hospital. After a long time, she slowly turned her eyes to look around. Hospital again. But it was an intensive care unit. She felt as if there were two fixed tubes delivering oxygen to her nose. She felt as if there was something clamped on her fingers. There were several medical instruments around her, and from time to time, beeping sounds could be heard. Jean opened her eyes and closed them again. After a moment, she opened them again. The nightmare-like experience on the highway lingered in her mind. She wanted to treat it all as a nightmare, but the faint pain in her stomach and the drip on the back of her hand told her the cruelest truth. If the child was still there, the doctor would not have given her an injection. The ward was very quiet. Jean didn't move. She didn't have the strength to move. She silently digested all this, and her heart and abdomen seemed to ache at the same time. She had a dream just now. She dreamed that Immerse took her to the upper reaches of the Los Angeles River. She dreamed that Immerse studio was officially listed in High City and became a joint stock real estate company. She dreamed that she and Immerse appeared together at the Domestic Business Managers Conference. She dreamed that they stood side by side, and she was by his side, becoming the best version of herself. But when she opened her eyes, she found that she was surrounded by a cold and pale ward. There was no one around. This was a sterile ward. Only doctors in sterile clothes could enter. Jean lay quietly alone. Seeing the doctor come in and check her body by the bedside, he found that Jean had woken up. The doctor put his gloved hand on her forehead and said to her in English as if comforting her, "Miss G, although I know this may be cruel to you, we must apologize to tell you that the child was not saved. It was not easy for an adult to survive such a huge fall and impact. You have been unconscious here for 5 days and successfully passed the critical period. After 2 more days of observation, you can be transferred to a general ward." Jean looked at the doctor silently and blinked gently, indicating that she had heard him. The doctor had seen many women who went crazy or emotional after suffering a major accident, but Jean was very quiet and motionless. She slowly closed her eyes and was very calm. But she was so calm that it made his heart ache. The doctor always liked patients who were so cooperative. Seeing that she was too calm and quiet, he said to her patiently, "It was our best medical team who performed the surgery for you. Please rest assured that your fertility was not affected. After you recover, you can have another child. The 2-month-old child is just a small embryo. Don't be too sad. Your injury is really serious. Falling at that speed is equivalent to falling from at least 4 or 5 floors. You are lucky to be alive. You will continue to have everything in the future. Rest well and recover." Jean closed her eyes silently and nodded slowly and weakly. 2 days later, as the doctor said, Jean could be transferred from the ICU to a general ward. Jean was still sleeping when she was transferred to the ward. When she woke up, she was already lying on the bed. Feng Ling pushed the door open and saw that Jean was lying there motionless with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the ward. She walked in. "Madame Mo came just now, but you were still sleeping. She personally made chicken soup for you to nourish your body." With that, Feng Ling came over and opened a white thermos flask by the bed. The fragrance from it instantly wafted out. Jean had been unconscious for 5 days and had been in the ICU with an oxygen tube for 2 days. She hadn't spoken for a week. When she smelled the fragrance, her chapped lips moved. She wanted to speak, but her voice was too hoarse. "Where is Mo Jingxian?" Jean asked where Mo Jingxian was, not how he was now. If the answer was that he was still in the hospital, it meant that at least he was still alive. If the answer was, not in the hospital, Jean Wan didn't dare to think further. She turned to look at Feng Ling, who was helping her to ladle the chicken soup. "Answer me." Feng Ling ladled the chicken soup out and gently stirred it in the bowl with a spoon to make the soup less hot. While stirring, she said, the body and the interior of the car were seriously deformed. Mr. Mo's driver's seat was too narrow. When his head was hit, a steel bar in the car pierced Mr. Mo's cervical vertebrae and spine, and another one directly penetrated his shoulder. Jean Wan's hands on her sides instantly clenched, and her body was cold. Chapter 355. Feng Ling came over and shook the head of Jean Wan's bed, trying to feed her soup. Jean Wan didn't open her mouth but looked silently at the door. After a long silence, she asked, "His cervical spine and spinal nerves were injured. Will he wake up?" Feng Ling tightened her grip on the spoon. Although Jean Wan was not a medical student, she certainly knew the most basic human knowledge. The spine and cervical spine were both key parts of the brain. Even if Mr. Mo's vital organs were not injured, it was a miracle that he could survive such a serious car accident. But judging from the fact that he had been in a coma for 7 days and was still in danger, it was unknown whether he could wake up or not. The doctor had said that there was only a 30% chance that Mr. Mo could survive. If he couldn't hold on, the result of the treatment was likely to be a coma. But she couldn't tell Jean Wan this at all. But now, even if she didn't say it, Jean Wan could guess it. Feng Ling was silent for a moment, sat by the bed, and put the bowl to her mouth. "Mrs. Mo has been in the hospital these days. She made this soup and brought it to you. Drink some first." "Mrs. Mo." Jean Wan looked at the chicken soup in the bowl. Sure enough, Ms. Wanju's cooking skills were really good. She could smell the soup just like a chef. She couldn't imagine how Wanju felt when she endured the pain of losing her son and the pain of her daughter-in-law's miscarriage and insisted on making soup for her. "Drink some. Mrs. Mo's pain and worry are no less than yours, but she is really strong. For Mr. Mo's sake, you have to hold on, especially you. Now you have to take good care of your body. And if you drink this soup, Mrs. Mo will feel better." Jean Wan obediently took a sip. It was indeed delicious. It was light but not tasteless. How long will it take for him to pass the critical period? After a few sips, Jean Wan couldn't drink anymore and asked hoarsely. Knowing that she couldn't drink now, Feng Ling put the bowl aside and answered, "I don't know. He still needs to be observed and treated. Dr. Chin has rushed here after receiving the news. Don't worry about the medical environment in the United States. As long as there is a glimmer of hope, they will use the best medicine and medical means to save Mr. Mo." Since Feng Ling had said so, even if Jean Wan's heart was falling apart, she could only keep calm on the surface. They didn't want her to be too sad. It was unnecessary for her to be sad now. The only thing she could do was not to let them worry about her. After another week, Mo Jingxin was still in a coma. There were even a few times when he was critically ill but was saved in an emergency. During this period, Jean Wan couldn't sleep well every night. As long as she closed her eyes, she would see the scene of the black Bentley rushing over in front of her. The loud crash and the soaring shock woke her up again and again, and then she couldn't sleep anymore. These days, the news she learned from Feng Ling was that Su Shui died in the car with the spontaneous combustion system. When the Los Angeles police came to investigate, they did presume that Su Shui had some grudges with Jean Wan, and because of her emotional instability, she wanted to die with Jean Wan, but in the end, she died in the exploding car. When the police went to the Su family to collect evidence, Elder Su and Su Jilan didn't say much. Only Su Jilan told the media that Su Shui was her closest cousin, and she didn't expect her to be so crazy that she would go to such extremes as dying with others, one by one, the responsibility was piled on Su Shui. Dead men tell no tales. Although this case was not closed hastily, the police had basically confirmed the situation, so they did not continue to search for the truth so seriously. Even if Jin Wan wanted to confront Su Jilan now, she couldn't go out of the hospital, and Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up. She didn't have the energy to identify or accuse Su Shui. After all, she didn't have any evidence. Su Jilan really made use of Su Shui. Everything was so natural that even the police with a keen sense of smell didn't notice anything wrong. But Jin Wan wouldn't let go of the murderer who caused her miscarriage. Time passed day by day. Jin Wan couldn't get up at first, but a few days later, she could walk around the ward, and half a month later, she could occasionally go to Mo Jingshan's ICU and stare blankly. There was no glass in this ward, so she couldn't see what was going on inside or the people inside. She could only feel the man a few meters away from her through the wall, but somehow she felt he was so far away. Every day, the first thing Jin Wan asked when she woke up, "Is Mo Jingshan awake?" The answer she got was a shake of the head. Jin Wan couldn't imagine that he had been in a coma for nearly 20 days, but from the doctor's occasional conversations, she could tell that the worst result was that he would sleep forever. The winter nights in Los Angeles were really cold. Standing outside Mo Jingshan's ward, Jin Wan raised her hand and touched the cold wall. The light in the wall had been out for a long time, but she still refused to leave. She just wanted to stay here with him, waiting for him to wake up and open his eyes. After being separated by the wall for so many days, Jin Wan recalled her relationship with Mo Jingshan in her previous life. It was so simple for a person to disappear from life. Mo Jingshan disappeared so completely in those 10 years, just like now, silently and without a trace. Fate seemed to play a big joke on Jin Wan. She thought she had found back everything she had lost in her previous life, but now it seemed to be pulling away bit by bit. In her previous life, Mo Jingshan could return to China safely after 10 years. How could he stay in a coma now? 2 days later, Jin Wan squatted alone outside Mo Jingshan's ward in the middle of the night. She looked out of the window at the moonless night sky and waited for him to wake up longer and longer. When Jin Wan was well enough to be discharged from the hospital, it had been a month since the car accident. Mo Jingshan had been in a coma for a month. 3 days ago, the doctor said that he had passed the critical period and his life had stabilized, but when would he wake up? Maybe tomorrow, or maybe never. Jin Wan wanted to stay with him in the hospital, but Wan Zhu forced her to go back to the Mo family in Los Angeles. With Jin Wan here, Wan Zhu felt that Mo Jingshan was also here. Seeing Jin Wan, she felt at ease and didn't want Jin Wan to be in a daze every day and night in the cold hospital. Lying in the bedroom where Mo Jingshan used to sleep, Jin Wan called him 3 times a day even though she knew his cell phone wasn't answered. Every time, his cell phone was turned off. Jin Wan followed Wan Zhu to the hospital again, but she still couldn't enter the ward at will. She hadn't seen him for a month. Jin Wan squatted in the corridor, holding her cell phone and texting Mo Jingshan. She only sent one sentence. Mo Jingshan, I'm scared. Dash. Chapter 356. The police had closed the case of Su Shui's death in the car. On the day the case was closed, the head of the police came to the hospital. Mo Xiaozi took the photos taken at the crime scene and saw the photos of Mo Jingshan's smashed black Bentley. He negotiated with the police about these photos and asked the truck driver's confession. Jin Wan walked past them, heard what they said, saw the stack of photos in Mo Xiaozi's hand, and saw the black smoke spreading from Su Shui's car after the fire was extinguished. She suddenly turned to look at Feng Ling who had been following her. Come with me to the Su family. The Su family. Su Shui's home. Su Shui's parents were in charge of the Swan Group in Los Angeles, which was not to be underestimated. However, Su Shui's parents were obviously just honest businessmen and had never participated in the affairs of Elder Su and the Su family. When Jin Wan arrived at the Su family, Su Shui's parents almost rushed up to strangle her when they saw her, saying that she killed their daughter. Feng Ling stopped Su Shui's parents expressionlessly, and with Feng Ling's cooperation, Jin Wan entered the Su family unimpeded. B*TCH. Our Shui has been killed because of you. What are you doing here? Get out of here. We don't welcome you here. Jin Wan entered the door and heard the roar of Su Shui's parents. She stopped and looked back at them coldly. If you had been a little wary of the people closest to you, Su Shui wouldn't have ended up like this. She was killed because of me. Did she really die because of me? Su Shui's mother had been crying for a month and stared at her with swollen eyes and pale face. Su Shui's father, who was still rational, pointed at Jin Wan and scolded, "Our Shui was tortured to madness because of you. She barely survived, but in the end, she died because of you. How dare you say she didn't die because of you?" Jin Wan turned around and no longer looked at them, and the faint trace of mockery in her eyes did not fall into their eyes. She just said lightly, "I almost died in the hands of your daughter twice. Maybe I am indeed more fortunate than her. At least I don't have a sister who seems to be close to me but actually wants to use me to harm me." Jin Wan suddenly paused. Why not? Wasn't her previous life ruined in the hands of her good sister, Ji Mengran? Therefore, the scariest thing in the world is never the enemy standing in the open, but the so-called closest person who plays with you every day and seems to be on the same side as you, but is always trying to push you into the abyss. What do you mean? What did Shui's death have to do with Jilan? We all know that Jilan and Shui grew up together. Don't think that just because Shui is dead, there's no evidence. Now you're still trying to point the finger at Jilan. You're still trying to sow discord at a time like this. Women are truly the most vicious. Father Su couldn't push Feng Ling away at all. After cursing for a long time, he could only be blocked by Feng Ling. Jin Wan was expressionless. Based on Su Shui's suicidal behavior, the police concluded that she was the mastermind of the whole thing and hastily closed the case. As her parents, are you really willing to let your daughter bear the crime of attempted murder and self-immolation? Jin Wan didn't look at them but spoke while observing everything in the Su family, her voice cold and indifferent. Father Su and Mother Su's expressions changed slightly and they stared at her. Where is the room where Su Shui used to live? Jin Wan asked directly. Father Su hesitated and looked at Jin Wan's back suspiciously. When he was about to speak, Mother Su grabbed his arm with a broken look and stopped him from speaking. You can't let her into our daughter's room. We can't let such a woman who killed Shui enter Shui's room. Jin Wan abruptly turned her head, only to see Su Jingshan's mother's red eyes. For a moment, she thought of how Mo Jingshan's mother had not shed a single tear in front of her these days despite her depression. Jin Wan paused and then said, "Are you sure I killed Su Shui? Am I not one of the victims?" Mother Su ignored her and looked away with red eyes. Father Su pointed to the second floor. Second floor, the room with the white door. Jin Wan withdrew her gaze and turned to walk in. The Su family was not small. She walked up the stairs and circled around on the second floor before she found Su Shui's room. The servants of the Su family were surprised to see her, but no one dared to stop her. They just stood aside and looked strangely at the person who suddenly broke in. Jin Wan walked into the bedroom that Su Shui used to live in. The room that was filled with the heart of a young girl had not changed even though its owner had passed away. It was as though someone had insisted on cleaning it every day for the past month. Even the KT cat pillow on the bed appeared as though it had just been washed and was neatly placed there. The room was filled with the smell of air freshener. Jean Wan looked around, walked to the table in the room, and saw a delicate photo frame, in which the photo was a group photo of Su Shui and Su Jilan. She picked up the photo frame, turned it over, and opened it. When the photo fell out, she saw the words on the back, 200x, taken in Japan. That was to say, Su Shui and Su Jilan had been to Japan a year ago, and Su Jilan was not locked up at home by Elder Su because of mania as people said. Relatively speaking, she was very free. On the table shelf were some simple items that were suitable for young girls. How could someone with the heart of a romantic young girl be so vicious and merciless as to run all the way to T-City to kidnap her? Jean Wan opened the drawer under the table and asked the servant at the door, "Did Su Shui have any contact with anyone other than her cousin when she was alive?" The servant didn't know who Jean Wan was and subconsciously answered, "Before she went crazy, she had a good interpersonal relationship with her friends and classmates, but when she suddenly dropped out of school and said she was going to study in China, she only kept in touch with Miss Su Jilan." At this time, Jean Wan's hand paused in the drawer. She looked at the bottles of medicine in it, picked them up, opened them, put them to her nose, and sniffed them. Suddenly, her eyes were cold, and she covered the bottles again and held them in her palm. She continued to rummage through the other things in the drawer and asked, "Did Su Jilan also send these medicines?" Chapter 357. Really? Jean Wan held the bottle of medicine in her palm. If it were any other medicine, she might not have recognized it so quickly, but at this time, she didn't know whether it was fate or fate. She had taken this kind of medicine. It was the same medicine that Ji Mengran had taken to stimulate her emotions and cause her mental disorder. How could this be a medicine that could calm her down? This kind of medicine would only make Su Shui, who was already crazy, more emotionally unstable, and more unable to withstand any stimulation. What was mania? Everyone knew that Su Jilan had this kind of illness, but they didn't know that she had driven her cousin crazy. Jean Wan went to check Su Shui's wardrobe and the drawers and tables in several other rooms. She tried to just check and look through them and put them back neatly before closing the door. She had to respect the dead. Even if she didn't like Su Shui, she still had to behave herself. The result of the examination proved that Su Jilan did give Su Shui this kind of medicine that could cause mental disorder. The original cause of madness was neurasthenia. This kind of medicine would aggravate Su Shui's illness, and if the doctor didn't give Su Shui a blood test, he couldn't guess the cause or find out the cause. Jean Wan called Kay and asked him to go to the police station to get Su Shui's autopsy report. Even if Su Shui was blown to pieces, the autopsy report must have been done by the forensic doctor. In the afternoon, Jean Wan had stayed at the Su family for several hours, and Father Su and Mother Su had gradually calmed down and sat on the sofa opposite her. Trying to be as calm as possible, Jean Wan had a rough idea of what had happened after hearing some things from Father Su and Mother Su. "I've asked you so many questions, but I haven't said a word about Su Jilan. You can continue to think that I wanted to drag Su Jilan down with me after Su Shui died, but if you calm down and think about it carefully, when Su Shui and I were kidnapped at the same time and woke up in that car, the driverless car was already on the highway. The worst result was that Su Shui and I died together. The dead can't testify. Who will benefit most if we both die?" Father Su frowned and didn't speak. They were businessmen and naturally knew the cause and effect of many things. These days, they only focused on Jean Wan and Su Shui, but ignored Su Jilan who had been caring for them. As for Su Shui's case, it was highly likely that Su Shui directed and acted on her own. The police investigated and collected evidence from various parties and found that it was indeed Su Shui who initiated it. When the police went to Elder Sue and Su Jilan to investigate, they obtained the most useful testimony, which determined the outcome of the case. But if he really led this matter to Su Jilan's point of view, it didn't seem that simple. At this moment, Mother Su suddenly received a call. When she put down the phone, she looked at Jin Wan and then at her husband by her side. She said in a low voice, "It's Jilan. She said she'll come to visit us in the afternoon and asked if we need to bring anything." Father Su's face was gloomy and he didn't say anything, but Jin Wan asked with a faint smile, "After Su Shui died, did Su Jilan often come to see you?" "No, she just stayed by our side during the memorial service. Other times, she would usually call us every 2 or 3 days to comfort us. She said that she would be our daughter in the future and that if we needed anything, we should tell her." Mother Su was still sobbing a little. With red eyes, she said, "Today was the first time she said she would come to our house. Looks like Miss Su knows I'm here." Jin Wan smiled mildly as she glanced at them. "I won't see her. When she comes, tell her to look for me at the police station. I'll wait for her there." Su Chinxi's father suddenly frowned and said, "Although the things you asked just now do make sense when we think about them carefully, you can't wrongly accuse a good person. Jilan has been very good to our family. If you hurt Jilan just to clear your name or for your own interests, we won't allow it." Jin Wan said expressionlessly, "The case has been closed. I'm the victim from the beginning to the end, and the police didn't make things difficult for me. Why do I need to clear my name? Benefits? What are my benefits? My 2-month-old baby is gone. Do you think I have to sacrifice my husband's life and the baby's life just to make Su Jilan a suspect?" Speaking of Mo Jingshan's current situation and Jin Wan's miscarriage, Father Su and Mother Su fell silent. Jin Wan was going to find out the real murderer behind the scenes and avenge her child and Mo Jingshan. Today, she came here to sort out her emotions and thoughts. Now that she suddenly mentioned these things, she felt very depressed. She stood up and walked out without looking back. Jin Wan went to the police station and handed over some of the evidence she had collected in the Su family to the police. At the same time, she gave a recording pen to the police. The content of the recording pen was from the moment she walked into the Su family to the moment she left. In the past few hours, the conversation with the servants, the conversation with Father Su and Mother Su, as well as some detailed details of the process. After all, Jin Wan was Mo Jingshan's wife. She suddenly demanded a reversal of the case and a new investigation, so the police did not dare to neglect her. Su Jilan's biggest advantage was that no matter what happened, no one would suspect her, so she could avoid all the suspicions and get away successfully. But now, as long as all the suspicions were piled on her and the police kept investigating her, there would be results. Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up yet, so she couldn't get more favorable evidence from him. But now, as long as Su Jilan's suspicion was cleared, she wouldn't be able to continue to get away with it. In the evening, Su Jilan, who had been to the Su family, soon arrived at the police station. As soon as she entered the police station, she saw Jin Wan, who had just come out of the police evidence room, and Feng Ling standing at the door. Su Jilan paused, then gave a faint smile and looked straight at Jin Wan, who had raised her eyes to meet hers. "You're here." Jin Wan glanced at her flatly, without a smile or anger. Her eyes were as pale as a thick fog, but hidden in the fog was a killing intent that she had never had in her previous lives. Chapter 358. The real murderer hasn't been found, and the case is closed. How can I be reconciled to it? Jin Wan's words were indifferent and straightforward. "Miss Su, I just casually said that I would come to the police station. If you want to see me, come to the police station to find me. I didn't expect you to come so soon." didn't you go to the Su family to accompany Su Shui's parents? Seeing the coldness in Jin Wan's eyes and the hidden meaning in her words, Su Jilan looked at her incredulously and then smiled casually. Miss Ji, didn't you say that you would wait for me at the police station? Is it more important to see Su Shui's parents or to come to the police station to see me? Jin Wan was calm and collected. She did not even raise her eyelids. Her indifferent tone conveyed a clear coldness and disdain. I'm afraid you only went to the Su family to pay a visit before heading straight to the police station, right? Su Jilan slowly frowned and stared at Jin Wan. What on earth do you want to say, Miss Ji? Don't you know what I want to say? Otherwise, why would you come to the police station in such a hurry? Jin Wan's lips curved into a smile. I've already submitted the evidence to the police. I'll leave the rest to you, Miss Su. Su Jilan's smile gradually became unnatural. Why don't I understand what you mean? Didn't you ask me to come to the police station because Shui's case has been closed? Jin Wan was not in the mood to deal with her. Her eyes were cold, but her lips were slightly smiling. Miss Su, you're so good at acting. I used to think that you were too simple, too emotional, and too impulsive, but obviously, Su Shui was also deceived by your false appearance, so she wholeheartedly stood up for you. Su Jilan also smiled. I see why you asked me to come to the police station. Did you want to drag me down after Shui's death? I never expected that Miss Ji would be so cunning and ruthless. Shui's body is still warm. You should have stayed in the hospital to guard Jingshan. Why did you come out to torment our Su family? Jin Wan's delicate and mild eyes were filled with faint mockery. You'd better leave these words to the police. For example, how are you going to explain that the drugs you gave Su Shui to treat her are actually drugs that will make her mentally and emotionally unstable? The smile in Su Jilan's eyes gradually faded. She looked at Jin Wan and didn't speak, but her fingers suddenly tightened around the bag, betraying the shock in her heart. Are you surprised that I discovered something from this colorless and odorless medicine? Miss Su still has a lot to explain to the police. For example, before Su Shui went to Tea City, you frequently drank with her and complained to her, and then gave her a lot of small gifts. After she was instigated by you to go to Tea City, you closed the door to her when she came back. It wasn't until something happened to her and she became crazy that you began to play the role of a good cousin. You can also explain to the police that while Su Shui was crazy, you said that you were taking her out to relax, but in reality, you were taking her to the cinema to watch horror movies, to the amusement park, or to some haunted houses. You had no intention of improving her madness at all, and you didn't intend to comfort her. In addition, you can also explain to the police that Su Shui was resting at home with a cold that night, but you suddenly took the initiative to ask her to accompany you to the party. She didn't have anything like a fruit knife in her bag, but you asked her to bring a knife to protect herself because she was afraid of people. The dress she wore at that time was chosen by you at the last minute, wasn't it? She should wear size S, but she wore size M that day. It can be seen how anxious you were before you went to the party. You didn't even give her time to change into a dress of the right size. Also, do you think the purchase record of that modified new BMW can be erased like the record of the courier company? After all, BMW is not a company you can easily threaten and control. They still have a record of car purchase. For example, you said you would give Su Shui a new car, and the car was registered in Su Shui's name, but on the day you bought the car, you swiped the card of your family servant. A week later, you transferred money from your grandfather's card to fill the vacancy in the servant's card. Your grandfather's card has been in your hands for a long time. You went around in a big circle just to hide your car purchase record. Su Jilan's face grew paler. She looked calm, but the flicker in her eyes revealed some of her emotions. Jin Wan's exquisite face coldly smiled. The recordings and evidence I've submitted aren't enough to drag you into this. But Miss Sue, you're too suspicious. The police will investigate based on this evidence. Did you think that no one would suspect you? Sue Gilland pursed her lips. It's just your guess. I can understand that you don't want me to live a peaceful life, but I've been with Shui for so many years. You can't just provoke us. She won't. Her soul in heaven should be awake. Once you say these lies, aren't you afraid she will come back to kill you in the middle of the night? Jean Wan was not in the mood to argue with her. I advise you not to waste your saliva on me. If you want to explain, go in and talk to the police yourself. Jean Wan said again, the Su family is indeed rich and powerful in Los Angeles, and they can use their wealth to hide some things in the police station to keep their innocence. But now the Mo family is involved, and Mo Jingshan has not woken up yet. If the Su family wants to cover up the truth, they have to ask the Mo family first. With that, Jean Wan walked straight past Su Jilan. Su Jilan suddenly stood in front of her. Jean Wan, you know Jingshan hasn't woken up yet, and you just had a miscarriage. Are you sure you have good intentions by causing a scuffle between the Su family and the Mo family at this time? The word miscarriage was really harsh to hear from Su Jilan's mouth. Feng Ling reached out and pulled Jean Wan over. Su Jilan glanced at Feng Ling and moved her lips, but in the end, she just lowered her voice. Jean Wan, we'd better not involve others in our affairs. My grandfather is old, and Jingshan's parents are worried sick because of Jingshan's coma. You don't have to vent your anger on all of us because of Shui's matter. Chapter 359. Su Jilan's hand trembled and she tried to free her hand, but Jean Wan held it tightly. What are you doing? Let go of me. Su Jilan struggled to break free from her hand. But Jean Wan still held her hand tightly. Her smile was cold, but her voice was so light that only Su Jilan could hear it. How can I let go of you? I won't let go of you until the murderer who killed my child is brought to justice. Jean Wan, did you think that Su Shui's death meant that there was no evidence? Did you think that the police would close the case as soon as possible while Mo Jingshan was unconscious? Did you think that no one would suspect you? Did you think that you could continue to be a spotless young lady, continue to play the role of a manic, timid, and emotional patient? Did you think that you were invulnerable? Let go of me. Su Jilan, let me tell you, I'm a calculative person. Every wound you cause me, I'll return it to you tenfold. Even if I dig out your heart, stomach, and uterus, I won't be able to get rid of the hatred in my heart for what you stole from me. Don't think the Mo family won't suspect you and no one will do anything to you even if Mo Jingshan doesn't wake up. Su Jilan was still trying to free her hand, but Jean Wan was so strong that she held her wrist so hard that she almost broke her wrist. From beginning to end, Feng Ling didn't reach out to help restrain Su Jilan, because she saw a woman who was extremely angry because she had lost her unborn child. Feng Ling had never seen Jean Wan like this. It wasn't until Jean Wan finally let go that Su Jilan was able to break free. She took a step back and looked at Jean Wan's flat belly with lingering fear. It's just your suspicion. Su Jilan calmed herself down and tried to stay away from Jean Wan. At this time, a policeman came out of the police station. When he saw Su Jilan, he asked her to enter the interrogation room to record her statement. Su Jilan hesitated for a moment before turning to look at Jean Wan. Jean Wan just looked at her indifferently and said nothing. When they walked out of the police station, it was snowing outside. Feng Ling wrapped the scarf around Jean Wan's neck and whispered as they walked to the car, Mrs. Mo, do you need me to inform the base about this? There's no need. Once the Mo family gets involved, the Su family won't be able to get away with it. Mo Shaoze is the chairman of the Shine Group, and he'll put pressure on the police in person once the suspicions about Su Jilan reach him. Alright, let Director Mo do it. After all, Mr. Mo hasn't woken up yet, and he has nowhere to vent his anger. When they returned to the hospital, Mo Jingshan was still unconscious. His ward was still not open to anyone. It was already dark, and Wanju took Jin Wan back to the Mo family. At dinner, there was soup specially made for Jin Wan. Since Jin Wan's miscarriage, she had been drinking soup almost every day to nourish her body. Jin Wan always felt that Wanju was trying to find traces of her son in this world in this way. Every day, Wanju said nothing. The two words that everyone in this family was most afraid to hear now were sleep and vegetative state. This was the most frightening result. After dinner, Jin Wan returned to the bedroom, closed the door, and went into the bathroom. After taking a shower, she sat on the edge of the bed with the laptop that Mo Jingshan had used before. She opened the mailbox and saw the work emails from Moon Wan's studio in High City, but she was not in the mood to read them. She just sat on the bed, stared at the words on the screen, and raised her hand to touch the roses in the vase beside the bed. The flowers were put in by the servants in a fixed number of rooms every day. On the night of the spring festival, Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan lived here, and she saw the roses in the same position. What did she say at that time? On her birthday in Tea City, she didn't even touch the rose petals on the ground before she destroyed them, so now she felt sorry for the roses. She curled up on the edge of the bed, looked at the flowers, took out her cell phone, took a photo, and sent it to Mo Jingshan. The flowers in your room are so beautiful every day. I haven't seen you for a month. I don't even know if you are withered or in full bloom. Sometimes people might have such a persistence, especially for the people they loved. Whether the other party was alive or dead, even if he was just a pile of yellow bones, as long as she could see him, at least she would feel at ease. But in the whole month, the only 2 times she looked in when the doctor opened the door were the 2 times she saw Mo Jingshan lying on the white hospital bed, quiet and motionless, his body full of various instruments and colorful wires and tubes. He didn't open his eyes, not even his eyelashes moved. But in the blink of an eye, the door was closed, and she never saw him again. It had been a whole month. Jin Wan called Mo Jingshan 3 times a day as usual and sent him a text message before going to bed as usual. As time went by, she was also very confused. If he continued to sleep like this, did he not want her anymore? Why did he come into her life so forcefully and change her life, but then lie there quietly and motionless, making her so afraid? It was snowing heavily. After a few more snowfalls in Los Angeles in February, this winter would be over. Jin Wan was wrapped in a white cashmere coat, sitting on the stairs in front of the hospital. Her head was covered with white snow. Because she hadn't moved much, the snow hadn't melted, so there was a lot of snow on her head. From a distance, she looked like a snowman piled up on the stairs. When Chin Siding walked out of the hospital and saw this scene, he put one hand in his trouser pocket and stared at it for a long time before he walked down to Jin Wan's side, patted the snow off her head, took off his coat, and put it on her. Jin Wan didn't need to turn her eyes. She just slightly tilted her head and saw it was Chin Siding's leather shoes, so she didn't move. He has been sleeping. It's meaningless for you to come here every day, Chin Siding said. I think you'd better go back to High City first. Your studio still needs you, and the G family and grandfather Mo also need you to go back and comfort them. Jin Wan silently looked at the car speeding by and said indifferently, Dr. Chin, didn't you also fly here from High City? Why haven't you gone back after staying here for so long? Your home and the focus of your work are in High City, but you have been here recently. Aren't you also waiting? Chin Siding looked down at her. After a moment, he sighed with a smile and simply sat down on the same stairs as her, looking in the same direction as Jean Wan. After a long time, he said, "Even I don't know when he will wake up. If he doesn't wake up for a year, are you going to wait here for a year? If he doesn't wake up for 10 years, are you going to wait for 10 years? Jean Wan didn't speak, just holding her cell phone and scrolling through the messages she had sent to Mo Jingshan. Chapter 360. Jean Wan received a call from the police station. The driver of the giant truck died in prison in the early hours of this morning. Hearing this, Jean Wan put on her clothes and quickly went out of the door. When she rushed to the police station, the police showed her the surveillance footage of the prison and gave her the driver's death certificate and the forensic examination results. The forensic examiner found some chronic poison in the driver's body. When the driver died, he vomited black blood, and his internal organs had been destroyed unknowingly. None of his internal organs were intact. There was nothing he could do to save him. Watching the video replay of the driver suddenly vomiting blood and falling to the ground, and then looking at the forensic examination results, Jean Wan felt cold hands and feet. Prison, chronic poison, vomiting blood. This was exactly the same way she died in her previous life. She used to think that because everyone in her previous life believed that she killed the daughter of the Yun family, the family of the deceased conspired with the prison to kill her, or Ji Mengran, who was far away in the United States, had some contact with the people in the prison. At that time, she didn't know the existence of An Shuyan or Su Jilan, but it didn't mean that they didn't know her existence. So who killed her in her previous life? This was exactly the same way he died. The replay pierced Jean Wan's eyes like a thorn. She could even feel the terrible pain all over the driver's body when he suddenly vomited blood and fell to the ground in prison. That suffocating feeling made her feel despair. Has Su Jilan returned to the Su family? Jean Wan paused the replay and looked up at the police station. Yes, Miss Su has been taken back by her grandfather, but as a suspect, her freedom will be temporarily controlled by us, and she can't leave Los Angeles easily. Jean Wan clenched the forensic examination results in her hand, looked at the scientific name of the drug on it, and kept it in mind. After leaving the police station, Jean Wan used her cell phone in the car to check the ingredients and symptoms of this poison. When Feng Ling drove, she saw that Jean Wan had been sitting quietly looking at her cell phone, motionless as if there was no difference from a few days ago, but there seemed to be something in her eyes. Very cold, very cold. Jean Wan searched for the explanation of mania. The typical symptoms were an elevated state of mind, an increase in thinking and inner activities, overconfidence, and even exaggerated imagination and behavior. Most of the time, they would be agitated and uneasy, and they would not consider the consequences when carrying out any purpose. It was a disease that could not be seen when one was calm, but once the spirit was stimulated, or when one insisted on doing something, one would be overly dark and agitated, unlike ordinary people. Therefore, Su Jilan's mania was different from Su Shui's madness. Su Shui was really crazy and irrational, while Su Jilan had confidence and darkness buried under the surface of calmness and rationality. She had all kinds of tricks up her sleeves. Back at the hospital, Qin Siding had just come out of Mo Jingshan's ward when Jean Wan was already waiting in the corridor. "Dr. Qin, is this kind of drug common on the market?" Jean Wan handed him the results of the forensic examination. Qin Siding glanced at her, took the things she handed him, looked at them, and then looked at her. "This kind of chronic poison is not common in our country and can even be said to be rare, but it can be bought in some places in the United States. However, if you want to buy it, you have to go through certain channels, either with someone behind the scenes or with enough money. This kind of poison can stay in the body for 2 or 3 months without any symptoms. The drug is stable during the incubation period, but it is not certain that one day the poison will take effect, and there is no cure. How does this poison enter a person's body? Two ways: intravenous injection or ingestion through food. If it's injected, it will enter the blood vessels directly and die faster. If it's poisoned only by eating, it will die slower. The process can be long or short. I don't know much about this kind of drug, so I just know a general idea. With that, Qin Siding looked at Jin Wan coldly. Haven't the police found a remittance of 5 million yuan in his account? This is obviously the way he chose to die, and his wife and children have been settled. He was injected with this poison before the incident. Feng Ling. Jin Wan turned her eyes to Feng Ling behind her. Dr. Qin said that if you want to buy this kind of drug, you have to go through certain channels, which I guess only you can find out. Help me check if Su Jilan or anyone close to the Su family has recently bought this kind of drug. Okay. Feng Ling nodded. I'll send someone to check it right away. In the evening, she returned to the Mo family's home. Before she entered the door, she heard Wan Zhu and Mo Xiaozi quarreling. Jingshan hasn't woken up yet. This morning, you gave the only place to visit him to in Shuyan. You can go in yourself, or I can go in. When Jin Wan returns to the hospital, it's understandable for Jin Wan to go in to accompany Jingshan. But why did you let in Shuyan in? Jin Wan just had a miscarriage. Are you trying to take advantage of Jingshan's unconsciousness to drive away the wife he has always held in the palm of his hand? You weren't here in the morning, and I couldn't get to the hospital in time. Jin Wan went to the police station, and Xu Yan happened to go to the hospital at that time. It's reasonable for me to let her in. Besides, Jingshan is still asleep. How can he know who went in? How can he not know? Jin Wan hasn't seen him for more than a month. If she goes in to accompany Jingshan, Jingshan may be able to hear her, and Jin Wan may be able to wake him up. But you actually gave such a good opportunity to Shu Yan. Mo Xiaozi, oh Mo Xiaozi, people around you say you are an old stubborn man, and I have been protecting you. Now I find that you are really an old stubborn man. If Jin Wan finds out about this, how sad she will be. Go away. I don't want to talk to you now. You old stubborn man. Jin Wan stood outside the door of the Mo family's villa for a while and suddenly found that after more than a month of waiting and suffering, her heart had been dulled. She was no longer so easily angry or sensitive. However, because Mo Jingshan's condition had stabilized, she was finally allowed to go in to visit him alone. However, Mo Xiaozi didn't call her back to the hospital but let Shu Yan in. He really disregarded her too much. When the villa was quiet, Jin Wan pushed the door open and walked in. Wan Zhu looked back at her, got up, and walked up to her. Wan, why are you back so late? Chapter 361. The implication was that she had heard their conversation just now. Wan Zhu immediately glared at Mo Xiaozi with a reproachful look. Mo Xiaozi was about to sneer at her for not giving him face, but Wan Zhu glared at him. He swallowed his words, slammed the lid of the teacup in his hand, and said coldly, "As you wish." Marrying such an unreasonable husband was really infuriating. Wan Zhu hurriedly took Jin Wan's hand. Wan, Jingshan's condition is getting more and more stable. We'll stay in the hospital these days. As long as we can enter the ward, we'll let you in first. I know you miss him very much and want to stay with him for a while. I know. Don't be sad, child. Then Wan Zhu took Jin Wan back to the room, sat on the bed, and held her hand, saying, "In fact, Jingshan's father doesn't have much opinion of you. He just likes Xu Yan so much that it can only be attributed to preconceived notions. The marriage contract between Jingshan and the Su family was just a stopgap measure. At that time, Xu Yan was studying in the UK, not in the US, so Su Jilan's affair happened. In other words, in his heart, Xu Yan was raised according to the standard of the Mo family's daughter-in-law. He has always been on good terms with the Yin family, and he also watched Xu Yan being born and growing up, so their relationship is not the same. But Jing Shen, after all, has his own ideas. He spent more time in High City, and in the years he was in America, he rarely got close to his family. He rarely interacted with the Yin family, and he only met in Xu Yan a few times. You know what happened after that, and you know Jingshen's attitude, so don't let the stubborn ideas of Jingshen's father affect your mood. No matter what he does, he won't be so stupid as to force his son to divorce. He just doesn't want to give up and always wants to see if he can bring them together, but as long as you and Jingshen are as good as ever, he will give up after a long time. Jin Wan smiled. Perhaps it was because she grew up with her mother too little. Growing up with Ji Hongwen, she never knew what it felt like to have a good mother. But at this moment, she understood. Mo Jingshen, a cold and unreasonable man, occasionally showed a warm and amiable side. He must have inherited Wan Zhu's good temper. But to avoid such a situation happening again, Jin Wan moved back to the hospital. While Mo Jingshen was in a deep sleep, Jin Wan had not been idle. She was thinking of ways to avenge her child, to avenge Mo Jingshen, and to avenge herself. Good news came from Mo Nwan's studio in High City every day. Hearing that her studio had made more than 200 million yuan in profits in the past few months, Jin Wan just calmly held a video conference with everyone in the studio and continued to stay in Los Angeles. Grandfather Mo didn't know how Mo Jingshen and Jin Wan were, but they had been missing for a long time and hadn't returned to High City. He hadn't even heard Mo Jingshen's voice for a long time. After learning that they were in Los Angeles, he wanted to fly to Los Angeles several times to see them, but Jin Wan persuaded him not to. It was only when Ji Hongwen suddenly fell ill and was sent to the hospital that night that Jin Wan's vision darkened. Her heart turned cold. Jin Wan, who had been determined to stay in Los Angeles and stay with Mo Jingshen, finally wavered a little. In her previous life, she couldn't accompany Ji Hongwen in his last days. Even if Ji Hongwen's illness was caused by overwork and was not fatal, there was always a chance. Jin Wan couldn't gamble. Up to now, Ji Mengran was still missing and there was no news. Shen Haru was no longer at the Ji family. Ji Hongwen was the only one at home. If the servant hadn't found him early and sent him to the hospital in time, it was hard to say what would have happened. It turned out that every stage of a person's life was full of too many unknowns. Many things had to be changed, but they also had to pay the price. On the phone, the servant of the Ji family said, "Chairman Ji is now in the hospital. His life is not in danger, but he needs to be observed and may be hospitalized for a long time. Are you going back?" Qin Siding asked her. Jin Wan didn't know. She had been in the hospital for so many days, but still couldn't find a chance to enter the ward. When she finally got the chance to visit Mo Jingshen, Wan Zhu and Mo Xiaozi were there. They were Mo Jingshen's parents, so she didn't compete with them for this chance. Even though Wan Zhu wanted her to accompany Mo Jingshen, Jin Wan insisted. After that, it was hard to get a chance. The sterile ward was rarely open. If it weren't for Mo Jingshen's physical fitness, he wouldn't have been able to get 2 chances to enter the ward. Jin Wan received a call from the Ji family again. The servant said that Ji Hongwen had lost a lot of weight recently and hadn't been able to eat for 2 days. He vomited as much as he ate. Although the doctor said his life was not in danger, he couldn't go on like this. They were worried that Chairman Ji wouldn't be able to hold on. When Mo Jingshen slept for nearly 2 months, Jin Wan finally nodded, silently packed up her things, and prepared to fly back to High City. Before she left, she didn't send him any text messages. She didn't know when he would see the messages she had sent in the past dozens of days. Feng Ling accompanied her to the airport. In the airport hall, people came and went. Jean Wan still remembered that when she secretly flew out of High City to Cambodia with Feng Ling, her heart had been anxious. Now, standing here, she was about to fly back to High City. She was no longer in a state of panic. But like duckweed without gravity, she floated all over the sky, unable to find an end or a home. At least at that time, she knew that Mo Jingshan was in Cambodia. She wanted to go to Cambodia to find him, and she did succeed. But where on earth was he now? After sleeping for so long, she didn't know whether she was in his dreams or where he had been in his dreams, and she couldn't find him. Feng Ling went to buy water for her, and Jean Wan went to line up for the boarding pass. She only took the simplest small silver suitcase. She didn't plan to stay long in High City and planned to fly back to Los Angeles when Ji Hongwen was better, so she didn't take much with her. When they were about to go through the international security check, Feng Ling hurriedly came back with the mineral water she had just bought. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. Feng Ling picked up the phone. When she heard what the other party said, her eyes changed, and she turned to look at Jean Wan with joy in her eyes. Holding the boarding pass and passport in her hand, Jean Wan turned to look at her. What's wrong? You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.